If I can, I'd like to call the Monday, October 27th, 2014, regular scheduled meeting of the Falls Church City Council to order. If you all could please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll call?
Mr. Baruch,
Here.
Ms. Conley,
Here.
Mr. Duncan,
Here.
Ms. Oliver,
Present.
Mr. Snyder,
Here.
Mr. Z,
Here.
Mayor Tarter.
Here.
We're all present.
Thank you. I understand we also have an amended agenda. Is there a motion to adopt the meeting agenda?
Move to adopt the meeting agenda as amended.
We have a second?
I'll second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed, abstentions, none? It's adopted. We've got a lot of new folks in the audience tonight. Welcome to all of you. We'll get to you in just a moment, but thank you all for coming out this evening. We're very excited to have you here. Let's go ahead and start with the first proclamation, or the proclamation we have. And we understand we have Mrs. Barb Cram. Barbara, are you here? She was here. There she comes, right on schedule. Okay, thank you for coming out. But Barb is leading an effort here in Falls Church to collect blankets for refugees in Syria and the Middle East. I'm going to read a proclamation right now, but I just thought I'd ask Barb to come up. She has some of the details in just a moment of the drive, but we thank you so much for all your help. Whereas residents of the City of Falls Church are encouraged to make an intentional, united effort to be of service, and whereas the Northern Virginia Regional Commission is uniting local governments of the Northern Virginia region to repeat a very successful program that was begun in 2013. Whereas the second year of the blanket collection will be conducted to deliver to the refugees from Syria and other countries that have sought refuge in Turkey. Whereas the second annual blanket collection drive for refugees from Syria and other countries transcends political and religious differences to unite all Northern Virginia residents with the goal of helping those people facing dire circumstances and struggling to meet their basic needs. Whereas between November 1st and November 22nd, 2014, all citizens are encouraged to make a concerted effort to contribute new or gently used blankets to drop-off locations at our Falls Church Community Center and other designated locations. Whereas packing and shipping services are being donated as part of the effort to get the blankets delivered directly to the refugees. Whereas all citizens, faith groups, businesses, and community organizations are invited to support and participate in the effort to collect blankets or funds for blankets. Therefore, I, David Tarter, Mayor of the City of Falls Church, do hereby recognize the period from November 1st to November 22nd as a refugee blanket collection drive in the City of Falls Church and urge our citizens to contribute new or gently used blankets or funds for blankets. Barb, would you like to come on up and maybe let us know a little bit more about the effort? Thank you so much for taking the lead on this. We all greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. It's a great opportunity to, I'm sure that we give them what we could on site. I guess many of you know, keeping up with the news, that with Kobani and the terrible circumstances there's been tens of thousands of people leaving various areas there for Turkey, because Turkey has open border policy. I learned about this last year, actually, because our church was working on this blanket drive, the first one, and Robert Lazaro, who works with the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, and several representatives from Northern Virginia region were doing a government exchange, and they had gone to Turkey, and they were asked after the meetings were over, would you like to see a Syrian refugee camp? And they said, yeah, let's definitely do that. So they went to the Syrian refugee camp, and Robert Lazaro was with the team, and he's still with the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, and he said that they walked around. It was really as far as refugee camps, a very impressive effort that Turkey has made. And they walked into this one tent, and they had a Turkish person and someone that spoke the languages there with them. And they went in, there was a man who was sitting there on the middle of the floor, well, the floor being the dirt floor, with nothing except the clothes on his back. And they asked him, tell us something about yourself. And he said, well, I've been a policeman in Syria for my job for 17 years, and they were bombing in Iran, and then ISIL was chasing us and shooting people. And he said, I just ran as far as I could. And he doesn't know where the rest of his family is. And it was really a long story, but at the end, when the story was told and related to the group with Bob Lazaro, he said, what can we do through the interpreter? What would you like us, can we do anything for you? He says, do you have a blanket? And that's how this whole thing got started. And they came back and they collected 18,000 blankets with that throughout the region here, Northern Virginia Regional Commission's region. And I'm really glad that they're doing this through the government entities to draw attention to, we're the, I guess according to the paper, we're one of the highest median incomes and educated people in the country, which pretty much is a lot. And I would hope that people would open their hearts and their wallets or just bring a blanket. And what we've done is we've recruited members from the school, which we're glad to see them here. They're going to be meeting with this week, and we're going to have collections there. But our public place will be at the Falls Church Community Center for now to start. And there'll be a collection box upstairs on the second floor, right where Howard Herman's ficus tree used to be. And I think everybody remember that because it was there forever. So that's where that collection area will be. And any other businesses or others that want to participate, we'll definitely promote that. But we wanted to thank the city for this chance to be able to serve and be of value. And I think it's a way to cross a lot of the misunderstandings that happen when people of different religions and different ethnicities, and having a group from Northern Virginia hand deliver these, which is what they did last year. Robert Lazaro said it changed my life. And so they're doing it again because the people are counting on it. And so anyway, thank you. I just wanted to tell you all a little bit about the background. So.
Thank you so much. I think it's a great endeavor, and we're looking forward to a great success with this, and we thank you for all your efforts.
Thank you.
Most appreciated. Would you like to come up and accept the, why don't you come on up and get the proclamation, Barb, if you can. We'll get a photo maybe if anyone's interested.
More paper, great.
We have a few speakers on the agenda. You can either speak now, or you can speak when the item that you wish to speak about comes up. So we would ask that you keep your comments to 3 minutes, that you state your name and your address for the record.
Mayor Tarter, I do
yes.
have an oath of office before we go to public comment.
Okay. Why don't we go ahead and do the oath of office then?
Okay, I have Jerome Barrett for the City Employee Review Board is here to be sworn in.
Come on forward. Thank you. Thank you for all your service, your many years of service.
Hi. And I'm just going to repeat after me. Okay. I, Jerome T. Barrett. Do solemnly swear. That I will support the Constitution of the United States. And the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia. And that I will faithfully and impartially. Discharge and perform. All the duties incumbent upon me. As a member of the City Employee Review Board. According to the best of my ability, so help me God.
According to the best of my abilities.
All right, thank you. And I just have you. Yep.
Thank you so much for your service. We greatly appreciate it. Okay, so as I was saying, we have two speakers at the present. If you wish to speak at a later time when the item comes up, you can speak then as well, but you should put in a speaker slip like this with the clerk. But we have two speakers right now, Mr. Ira Kalin, and you can speak now if you'd like, or you can wait till the item in which you want to speak comes up. Would you like to speak now, or would you like?
No, I'd like to wait for the item.
That'd be fine. And then our next speaker is Winthrop Rogers. Mr. Rogers, would you like to speak now? Yes, please. Welcome.
My name is Winthrop Rogers. I live at 202 East Jefferson Street. I'm here to talk to you about Isaac Crossman Park. My parents have lived on East Jefferson Street for about 15 years. I grew up there. Living and working in D.C., I frequently visit them and pass through Crossman Park. It's located, for the record, between Van Buren Street and Washington Street along 4 Mile Run near the Arlington border. A winding gravel path works its way through the woods, connecting the two streets. It's named for a distinguished farmer upon whose land the park now occupies. The park itself is well maintained, it's trash-free, and the gravel path is routinely repaved. Thank you. However, along the path there are several disused educational signposts. In the past, they've been the platform for educational material about forest ecosystems and the differences between urban and wild forests. The current states of these signs, however, is quite dilapidated. Only one sign remains in its original condition, but it's so faded and dirty as to be essentially unreadable. As rehabilitated, they will serve a purpose for parents and educators who may take their children and students through Crossman Park, or it may be of interest to passing commuters, such as myself. However, in their current state, they really are quite an eyesore. Recently, invasive species such as bamboo were cleared from the park, which is most welcome. The contractor, or an affiliate called the New Jersey Invasive Species Strike Team, presumably posted laminated printouts of various ivy species on the remaining signs. While it's better than nothing, it looks entirely haphazard, and all the information relates to ivy species in New Jersey. It seems like this is more publicity for the company rather than actual education. Across 4 Mile Run, there's a beautiful new rain garden with signs explaining its purpose, which apparently were produced by a company called Lands and Waters. The signs in the rain garden were jointly funded by Falls Church and the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation. I would ask this council that the educational signs along the gravel path in Crossman Park be rehabilitated in a similar manner as the signs in the nearby rain garden. The signs could be used to educate residents about urban forests, as they used to, or about the Potomac River watershed, or the history of Falls Church, or some other topic. Given the recent debates regarding our budget surplus, this would be a low-cost, high-impact way to make our city better. I urge this council and the Falls Church Department of Recreation and Parks to allocate the necessary funds to rehabilitate the educational potential of Isaac Crossman Park. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Shields, is that something we could take a look into?
We have. Those are excellent comments and very much appreciated. I walk through the park frequently, and I know exactly what he's talking about. And so we will work on that, and I think there are potentially some partnerships we could have with community groups, VPAS and others, who have been involved in these educational signs in the past, and so we will pick that up.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, are there any council requests? Any council requests? Okay, why don't we go, I'm sorry, do we have one council request? Okay, so why don't we go on to the presentation of the Youth Board and Commission representatives. This is very exciting. We welcome to all of you here this evening. We're delighted to have you here. Madam Clerk?
Yes, and Carol Lofter-Thune had some comments.
Welcome. Thank you for doing all the work you've done on this.
Oh,
It's an
thank
exciting
you.
day for all of us, I think.
It's been fun. So I'm Carol Lofter-Thune, 202 West Rosemary Lane, and back in January, I was having a brainstorm in the shower and came up with this idea on how to better engage citizens. Having been in nonprofits for about 16 years, I'm well aware that what seems to work with busy people especially is kids and puppies. So I thought, why not get more youth involved in our local civic life as a stealth campaign to get there more adults and parents involved as well. My fellow CBC Executive Committee members gamely stepped up to explore this idea with me, and soon Jerry Barrett, Craig Cheney, Lindy Hockenberry, Paul Hanley, and Ron Pepe were all brainstorming with me at Mad Fox. We had very crisp meetings, believe me. Our 5 goals were to create opportunities for youth to learn about local government and civics in a hands-on way, to give students opportunities to volunteer in meaningful ways, to enhance students' college applications, to better engage their parents and peers in community issues, and to demonstrate our city's commitment to youth by giving them a voice in decisions. We were especially interested in encouraging students who may not have previously had leadership opportunities to apply, and we wanted to focus on interest, commitment, and potential rather than past achievements. Well, we quickly learned that this really wasn't a new idea at all. The school board had already beat us to it, and Maeve Curtin had been a school board liaison for almost 2 years. But fortunately, that meant that Dr. Tony Jones, our superintendent, had lessons that she'd learned and was so supportive of the idea. Our city manager, Wyatt Shields, and George Mason High School principal, Ty Bird, were supportive as well. And after making the rounds with civic groups, VIPAS suggested that we broaden this to include youth reps to civic groups as well, and so we did. In May 2014, as you may remember, we presented this idea to City Council, and you all unanimously voted in support of moving forward with this concept. With your support, we invited the city's boards and commissions, as well as civic groups, to host up to 2 youth representatives. These youth representatives will be non-voting liaison positions and will not take part in closed sessions, but they are expected to make a real contribution to discussions and decision-making, as well as promote awareness among youth and our community at large. So imagine how thrilled we were when 13 city boards and commissions and 8 civic groups all signed up to host youth representatives. We were kind of stunned, to be honest. Our thanks to you, City Council members, and especially the Appointments Committee, chaired by Dan Z., with Mary Beth Connolly, who's been very supportive of this idea from the beginning, and Karen Oliver, who also has been so supportive, for helping to make this a reality tonight. And our thanks to these boards and commissions who each graciously and thoughtfully, and expeditiously too, considered our request to host these youth representatives. Our thanks as well to the city staff, Veronica Prince and Celeste Heath, as well as the staff at George Mason High School, the guidance counselors in particular, and George Mason High School PTSA. And a special thanks to Peter Laub and the High Student Council Association, especially SCA President Sarah Bowman Miller, for their help in promoting this new service learning opportunity for students through Schoology and their Facebook and Twitter social media. We then created our own website. It's www.youthrepresentatives.org, youthreps.initiative.org, and our own Twitter account to promote the idea, so I had to learn some new skills. And we're even more thrilled when 18 students applied and 17 of these decided to interview for the positions. My sincerest thanks as well to the volunteers from several civic groups who graciously agreed to serve as Youth Reps Recommendation Committee, there are too many R's in there, and take part in these 17 interviews. Jerry Barrett from CBC, Barry Buschow from the Falls Church Lions Club, and many other organizations. Craig Cheney, also from CBC, Mike Connolly from VIPAS, Ken Feltman from the Falls Church Republican Committee, I believe he's here tonight, Mary Ellen Gannon from the Falls Church AAUW, Debbie Hiscott from the Falls Church Education Foundation, Lindy Hockenberry from CBC, Mark Rhodes from the Falls Church Republican Committee, Blaise Sevier, who is the George Mason class of 2015 secretary, and Bemlock Hailemariam, who is the 2014 class vice president, as well as Harry Shovelin, American Legion Post 130. I got through all those names. After 17 interviews at the new Hilton Garden Inn, which generously donated space for us in their lovely lobby, along with the George Mason High School, our Youth Reps Recommendation Committee found that all 17 applicants were talented, committed youth who bring diverse backgrounds, viewpoints, and interests to our city boards and commissions, as well as civic groups. Only 5 have previously been a club president or held a comparable leadership role. All expressed an interest in learning more, getting more engaged in the broader community, and giving back. And many said that up until now, they haven't had much chance to focus on that because they were focused on their academics, athletics, or other activities. 1 is a freshman, 1 is a sophomore, 10 are juniors, and 5 are seniors. And they include youth from a wide variety of cultural and ethnic backgrounds, as well as experiences living and traveling abroad. So our committee is pleased to recommend all 17 to City Council's Appointments Committee without recommendation, and to fill the youth rep positions, and to recommend these candidates to you tonight. And now the moment you've been waiting for. I am proud and pleased to introduce our Fall 2014 class of youth representatives. You all stand.
So Ms. Conley?
Questions? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm standing in the way. I'm so sorry here, yes.
So what I thought maybe we could do is we're going to have a formal motion to appoint these folks to the various liaison committees, and we're done with the motion. We're going to ask that you all come up here and receive your certificates, and maybe we'll take a group photo, okay? So why don't we go ahead and do our motion, and thank you all for standing. We'll get you on up in just a second, but do we have a motion to appoint Mr. Z?
Thank you, Mayor. It's said that a republic survives, continues, and prospers with the involvement of all of its citizens. No finer example can we see but those in front of us tonight. And so it is with great pleasure for the fall cadre of 2014 that I move to appoint the recommended slate of students as youth board and commission representatives and to recognize the youth representatives appointed to our civic organizations.
I'll second that motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, abstentions? The ayes have it. Why don't you all come on up if we can, and we'll take some photos with you. Would you all like to do that? Why don't you come on up?
And I would like to announce their names as well, so maybe
Absolutely.
we can do that while everybody's on their way up.
That would be fantastic.
Okay, great. So we have Morena Allen Lewis for the Human Services Advisory Council. I'll wait. Yeah. We'll wait for Ian. There, oh, that's perfect. All right, so we have Morena Allen Lewis with the Human Services Advisory Council, Christian Autor with the Tree Commission, Camille Borgia with the Housing Commission, Jacob Bruner, Library Board of Trustees, Tiffany Chow Dang, Historic Architectural Review Board and Historical Commission, Tyler Gogol, Economic Development Authority, Jackson Jost, Environmental Services Council, Mary Keenan, Environmental Services Council, Haley Lofter-Thun, Human Services Advisory Council, Kieran Menon, Economic Development Authority, Nabil Osborne, Architectural Advisory Board and Historical Architectural Review Board, Ian Roosh, Citizens Advisory Committee on Transportation, Anna Wilson, Tree Commission, August Wilson, Falls Church Cable Access Corporation Board. And then we have, the following youth reps have already been appointed to these civic organizations. Camille Borgia, Lions Club, Varasara Jarasongsambun to the Falls Church Education Foundation, Eric Clinton to the Falls Church Democratic Committee, Aaron McFall to the Falls Church Republican Committee, and Anna Wilson to the Village Preservation and Improvement Society. And we are going to swear you all in just like we did before, so. So we're going to do this all at once. So when I say I state your name, you can all say your name at the same time, and then I'll leave a blank for your board or commission, and you can also do that, okay? And you're free to do this. So, I state your name. Good job. Do solemnly swear that I will support the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and that I will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all the duties incumbent upon me as a member of the good job, according to the best of my abilities, so help me God. Great, thank you. And we have certificates.
Let's hear it for Carol.
Congratulations to all of you. We're delighted to have you on board. Thank you for all your good work that you're about to do. And let me just say to you all that we know that many of you have homework to do, and we will not take offense if you do not stay for the entirety of our meeting. So please feel free to head home and do your schoolwork. Not the Redskin game, but schoolwork. And we look forward to seeing you at the various boards and commission meetings. So thank you all for agreeing to serve. We're delighted and proud of you all. So thank you. Okay, why don't we go ahead and move on to the report of the city manager, unless there's anything else first. What's that? Written comments. Thank you so much. Madam Clerk, will you read the written comments, please?
I certainly
I just
will.
wanted to take a quick moment and thank all the kids and all of our students who are participating in this endeavor. I think it's a great opportunity. Some of us on this dais have been involved in public service for a number of years, and what I hope you'll walk away from is that this hopefully is the first time you've been sworn in officially in a capacity, but I hope that there's many more swearing-ins to come in your future, and that this is really the first step in possible futures in public service, and that you'll continue to engage in your community, whether it's in an official capacity or in civic organizations or nonprofits. And I hope that you take this opportunity to really kind of take this and expand it out, talk to other students in other jurisdictions. It'd be great if we can actually expand this outside of Falls Church, because I think it's very innovative. I think it says a lot about you, and I think it says a lot about this community, and also about the parents involved. So I just wanted to thank the whole community for embracing this. So I think it's a great idea, and wish you all the best of luck, and look forward to hearing back from your various boards and commission capacities.
Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, if I might?
Yes, Mr.
I would just like to shower extravagant and lavish praise on Carol Lofter-Thune for coming up with this initiative. It's appropriate that I shower you with praise since you came up with the idea in the shower, you said.
As you now know.
In fact, I noted that you came up with the idea in the shower. It was perfected at Mad Fox, which tells me that we're up here meeting in the wrong places. Nonetheless, I am well aware of how many other things you have going in life, including your daughter's activities. She's one of the group of students sworn in tonight, and many other civic endeavors and professional activities. And it takes a village to make this sort of thing happen, but it takes an instigator to get it off the ground. And it is a thoughtful and expeditious exercise that you have carried off in less than 10 months. It's just very impressive, and it speaks to your personal initiative, and also the fact that it's an idea whose time has come, and that's evidenced by all the young adults and their parents who have embraced this excellent idea, and I just want to thank you very much for being at the forefront of it.
Thank you. Vice Mayor Snyder?
Thanks a lot, Mr. Mayor. It's my sincere hope that this experience will encourage and not discourage our young adults here for pursuing public service. It is a rare opportunity that we all have to vote and to participate in a city government like this that was hard won by a lot of folks who came before. So I have great faith that all of you will carry forward in the greatest traditions of the founders of this country and the founders of this city. So thanks again for your service.
Thank you. Okay, why don't we move on to the written comments, Madam Clerk?
Yes, and I just also wanted to say that if there are any older folks who are interested in volunteering, we do have openings on boards and commissions. And you're welcome to send an email to cityclerk@fallschurchva.gov if you would like to serve.
Madam Clerk, while you have that, do you know the boards and commissions that have vacancies? Maybe you could announce that.
I have, what's highlighted on here for me tonight is we have something open with Economic Development Authority and the Planning Commission, but there are things coming up all the time, and people actually reapply for their positions on the boards, and so it is competitive. So if you're interested in a particular board or commission, don't be shy about applying. We'd like to hear from everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a summary of written comments. These are comments that the council received since the last regular meeting. We got a request from the League of Women Voters asking the City Council and the school board to make additional information available in advance of the bond referendum for the Mount Daniel Elementary School. The Village Preservation and Improvement Society provided a copy of a position paper on facilitating green infrastructure practices for stormwater management and the proposed stormwater project in Berman Park. Falls Church City Schools asked the council to delay action on the budget carry forward items to allow for more community input and to discuss the issue at the joint budget meeting in November. Susan Healy of 6143 Leesburg Pike asked if the DMV Select Office might remain open and still accommodate employee concerns by reducing the hours of operation. Henri Bartholomew, 101 West George Mason Road, encouraged the city to take the necessary steps to provide the staffing and space needed to keep the DMV Select Office open. Dale Walton, 205 Southwest Street, asked that the city use at least a portion of the water sale proceeds to pay the cost of the upcoming bond referendum. Dave Mercer, 207 Grove Avenue, asked the council to keep the DMV Select Office open. Cindy Wackerbarth, 304 Walnut Street, wrote in opposition to the proposed Mason Row project. Paul Wackerbarth, 304 Walnut Street, wrote to question if the Mason Row project is economically viable over the long term. Rachel M. Clark, 618 Laura Drive, asked the council to consider a one-time tax rebate for middle and low-income residents of the city using any FY14 surplus and water sale proceeds. Hilton Mayer, 204 North Virginia Avenue, wrote in support of the Mason Row project. Victor K. Wong, 914 Park Avenue, forwarded 2 letters urging the City Council to vote no on TO 1429, the FY15 budget amendment carry forwards, and also no on TO 1430, the budget amendment to use water sale proceeds to fund the pension. And then Justin Castillo asked the council to take a deliberate and measured approach with respect to the disposition of the water sale proceeds. He asked the council to consider questions related to the pension fund, planned capital expenditures, and the implications of the ULI TAP study.
Thank you very much. Why don't we move on now to the report of the city manager, Mr. Shields?
Thank you, Mayor Tarter, members of council. I'd like to start off my report tonight just to provide a note of encouragement to Cindy Mester, who is at home recovering from surgery, and she had surgery last week. It was planned, and we send her the best and hope for a speedy recovery. And I hope she's not at home watching this meeting. I've received some emails from her, and she's under strict doctor's orders not to put her BlackBerry down and dedicate her efforts towards a speedy recovery. Secondly, I would like to preempt a question that I know I will get from Councilmember Z in the status of the light at Park and Penn, which is of broad interest of people on the street, of course. We had to go through the process for insurance claims for that pole replacement, but I can report that the pole and the parts have been ordered. I do anticipate that once it'll take us about a month to get those parts, and our contractor who installs them does have a backlog of projects that he's working on in the city, and we expect that the light will be installed by the month of January. For the public, with respect to Mason Row, we received board and commission comment and extensive public comment on this on the project, and all of those have been relayed to the City Council, and the City Council is working to review those. Staff has summarized those comments and we're right now providing guidance to the developer. We do expect that the developer will provide a revised submission in the next couple of weeks. We don't know the exact date, but they are working through all the comments that we provided them. And so while we're waiting for that reapplication, we just want the public to know that that's why there might not be much activity with respect to the application as we await that revised application. Again, we expect that in November. But that does change the overall process, and when council referred this out to boards and commissions, it set a date of December 8th to consider the application again. That date will be postponed, and once we have the application, we'll have a clearer idea as to what is a reasonable process time and when the council would have a vote on that later in the year. I want to just note the Urban Land Institute came to the City of Falls Church on October 15th and 16th, and we had what I think was a very important effort by a group of experts that was organized by Deborah Billick with the Urban Land Institute, and the technical assistance panel was led by Bob Wolf, who is with George Mason University with the Center for Real Estate Entrepreneurship. And Bob Wolf, along with 8 very seasoned and experienced professionals in land use development, worked very hard for 2 days to provide the city with advice on the future development of the George Mason High School campus. And day 1 was all about stakeholder input and fact gathering, and day 2 they worked on their presentation and their recommendations to the city. And it really was an example of the work that generally would take 6 to 8 months for a consultant to perform at great expense through the work of these professionals donating their time to the city. I think we got the benefit of some very good strategic thinking and experience in a very short period of time, and with the help of COG at a very low cost. And so the city will be sending them thank you notes. We've prepared a little packet for them to express their appreciation, and those will be going out very shortly. For the public who wants to see the results of their recommendations, they can be found on the city website. And if you go to fallschurchva.gov /Campus Joint Steering Committee, that link provides all the information on the technical assistance panel, but also all the minutes and all the reports for the work of the steering committee over the past 8 months, as they've been working first to develop the roadmap for this planning effort, and also reviewing some of the initial space fit analysis that was done by RTKL, and now the ULI TAP. And the steering committee is planning to meet next on November 6th to do a debrief on the TAP findings and recommendations, and then plot out our next steps in that planning effort. So again, that'll be on Thursday, November 6th is their next meeting. And lastly, if I could report on tonight's agenda, we have the approval of the Fairfax County agreement that the city has with the Fairfax County Health Department. And the Health Department of Fairfax County is the city's local health department, and it's a very important contract for us. I'll talk about it in more detail. But it also provides us an opportunity to provide the community an update on our work in preparation on health-related matters relating to Ebola and other health concerns. And one thing I would just note, in terms of our work as a city, the school system is very engaged in working with our professionals, both within our health professionals within the school system and working regionally and with our statewide counterparts to make sure that our public health system is working the way it should, and the protecting of public health everywhere. It is, I think, noteworthy that while we have had confirmed cases of Ebola in the United States and Texas, outbreaks of illness, whether it's the respiratory illness of enterovirus D68 or other contagious diseases, this is part of the daily work of our public health system across the country. And we work to monitor it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, investigate and prevent the spreads of all sorts of contagious diseases. So we're very well prepared and positioned to be able to work on emerging diseases as well. It's a core function of our public health systems, which the front line of that is our local health departments. And I just want to communicate to the public that Fairfax County Health Department is working with our first responders, with our school system, to make sure that we have all the information we need to react appropriately and to protect the public health. I'd be happy to answer any questions on that.
Any questions? Vice Mayor Snyder?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Thanks for this report, which I'd asked for at the last meeting. Do we have anything on our website at this point, information to the public?
We do. On the city's website, in our Human Services Department, we have links to our regional counterparts so that our messaging out to the public really is aligned with what our regional and statewide messages are on how the public can protect itself and work with our professional health professionals.
Do we have a scrolling feature that we can feature things from time to time?
We have our front page where we can, yes.
You may want to do that because it's front and center in a lot of people's thinking. Also, I know that the CDC issued new guidelines today, I think, so if you could update with regard to anything that's relevant there. Thanks very much.
Mr. Duncan?
Just one thing I wanted to call out in your very detailed report there on a range of topics. The considerable interest, I think, in the community, obviously, about school facilities, because we're discussing a referendum vote on November 4th about Mount Daniel, but a number of questions have arisen about the process for the high school. I just want to make sure I understood and everyone understands that the way you described the process that we've gone through up to date, it has been going on for 8 months of regular meetings, consultants involved, the ULI TAP activity. The bottom line here is there's quite a lot of activity going on about the high school that just may not have risen to the level of broad public awareness, but there is a lot of work going on.
That is correct. A lot of work has gone on sort of the building blocks of this planning effort. Notably the space fit analysis that the schools led with RTKL, and that work was done through the steering committee. In the coming months, there'll be much more visible planning for the high school. The schools will be working on a visioning process for the community to get engaged in what the future high school, what some of the key features of it should be. And on the same track, we'll be doing our planning work and our visioning work on the economic development side of it, which will help ultimately help fund that high school.
Mr. Baruch?
Thank you. Just a couple things. One, I wanted to also send my best wishes to Cindy as she recovers, and hopefully she's not watching this. So if I get an email, Cindy, saying you're watching this, that will not be good. Two, on Mason Row, one, if we can just make sure that that's prominent on our development link that's been postponed. I think this is the first time the public may be hearing that it's in fact going to be postponed from the date of the second reading. I anticipate that it's still going to be on our calendar because it was such advertised, but it's going to be, I take it, a motion to defer at that point, even though it may appear on our agendas. And then finally on the Ebola issue, I'd just like to note, just as an abundance of caution, given my day job, that I'd probably be best not to be involved in decision-making as far as the city goes on that front unless I have a chance to run it by our ethics office. So Wyatt, if you can just let me know if it's coming up on an agenda or an action item for the city, that way I can do further checking into it. And again, not that there's a direct conflict, but best I check with our ethics people. Thank you.
Other comments? Mr. Shields, would it be fair for the public then to assume that Mason Row will not be heard until January?
In terms of setting a new date, I think it's early to do that. I think it is definitely fair to say that there will be no action on December 8th. But we need to get the application and then work with them, depending on the scale of the changes of the application, to lay out what the proper process would be to evaluate it.
Great, thank you. And just a question, a general question. I understand the tennis court is going to be coming down next to the community center in the near future. Is that correct?
That is correct. The Great Falls and Little Falls Stormwater project is underway right now, and as part of that project, we'll be storing water to prevent flooding downstream there at the tennis court, and with cisterns essentially underneath the tennis court, and then it'll be repaved and the tennis court will be brought back into service. We've been doing tennis court renovations down at Cavalier Trail, and that project is being painted right now, and that tennis court will open up right when this one is being closed. And so we will make sure the public knows that for people who want to play tennis, that we have a brand-new court out down on Cavalier Trail.
And when do you anticipate the court next door to this closing approximately?
I don't have the date. I know it's going to be very soon. I think it's going to be within the next week.
Let me ask you one other thing also, just a comment. Are the lights coming down and being put back up, or are they going to use the same lights as they're currently there?
I don't know the answer to that question.
I would just say to the extent there are going to be any changes made to the lights, that you consider shielding those lights. I
Okay.
think there's a lot of light being thrown off to the neighbors on Great Falls Street, and so any kind of shielding or dark sky lighting, I think, would probably be most appreciated by those folks.
Yeah.
Okay, are there any other comments, or should we move to the first item on the agenda? Madam Clerk, will you call the first item, please? Thank you.
We have TO 1429, ordinance to amend Ordinance 1918 and Ordinance 1919 regarding the budget of expenditures and revenues, appropriating funds for the fiscal year 2015 for the general fund and for the capital improvement project funds by one, appropriating $159,779 in grant revenues, seized assets and contributions, and $1,001,250 in unspent operating funds for incomplete projects, unmet priority needs, and changes in priorities. And two, committing $597,000 in permit fee revenue for future development costs. And three, transferring $200,000 from the budget for WMATA obligations to the Special Transportation Fund. And four, approve cash funding vehicles rather than bond funding them.
Thank you, Mr. LaCondra. Welcome.
Happy Monday, Council. The clerk has taken care of reading everything for me, so Mr. Shields and I will answer any questions, and he may have comments.
I was just going to say that this is the ordinance that was approved on first reading, and so the cross-out text is just shown for council's reference. That's what was struck at first reading, and then there are no other changes since the council last saw this 2 weeks ago. We'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions of staff? Mr. Snyder?
I do have several questions. I noticed that in this package, we're talking about funding with today's costs, 8 vehicles total. And my question is, with those vehicles otherwise in the CIP for bond funding, I guess one of the issues I have is that if we do some of this now, rather than not do it now, are we going to see some positive benefits in terms of next year's budget?
Vehicles are, they're one-time expenses, and so they're a good use of one-time money like this. One of the problems we have citywide, we have a very old fleet. The dump trucks, for instance, they're 20-plus years old. They're very expensive to maintain, and so it will allow us to operate more efficiently and have lower maintenance costs.
I appreciate that, but my question is a larger budgetary question. Some of these they weren't funded in the last budget, right? So we fixed the tax rate based upon not funding them. Along they come. So theoretically, they would be in next year's budget if they were so essential that they need to be funded at all.
That's correct.
So what I'm trying to figure out is what value are we providing with regard to next year's budget by funding this with the surplus today? Because we've gotten requests from citizens about, why don't you do a one-time rebate? Why don't we see this money? And I guess to some extent, I'm looking for some evidence to show that, in fact, by doing this now, we are reducing next year's budget, bottom line. So tell me more about that.
What you're doing is, by saying that you want to put this off for the next year, you have a number of vehicles that need replacing. If we are not going to replace them now and we're going to keep putting them off, you're incurring more expense for maintaining them. You do have public safety issues involved with 6 of the vehicles, and that's why we brought it. Those vehicles, the police vehicles, we had intended to bond fund. There are issues with bond funding that because you need to pay them off within 5 years. So that changes your debt service structure. That's number one. Number two, on the sheriff's vehicles, they were in their unmet needs. And yes, they would show up on the upcoming budget again, if possible, depending on what the budget guidelines are. But the longer you put it off, the greater the potential for increased cost and for things to break down.
Okay, so I was using the vehicles as an example, but it's really a larger question, which is that by funding these items now, we are in essence funding items which you can say to me would be included in next year's budget if we did not fund them now.
It would probably be part of a request. Your overall issue is you don't have a vehicle replacement reserve, so you don't have a good timetable for replacing your vehicles and any of your equipment as it ages out. So what we've been doing is we do it on an as-need basis. We're given the age of the vehicles, how much it's costing in maintenance, and what the potential problems are. All right, you heard the problems about the dump trucks. I don't know what more to tell you other than if we wait and have them rust out, then you don't have any snow plows.
Right, well, no, I'm not, what I'm trying to do is get to even a larger issue than the vehicles, which goes to things like the IT work, the additional transportation person, it's the work on the Gage House, that what I want city staff to do is assure us on the record that these items would be in next year's budget in one way or another, except that we're funding it now, because I think citizens have gotten the sense, and there are some of these items which I'm going to raise more specific issues about, but overall, citizens have gotten the sense that this is stuff that's nice to have, and we'd rather have the money in our pockets, which is a pretty rational view for them to take. So my question to you is, if we did not fund these items tonight, would they have ended up in next year's budget? So one way or another, these are things we have to do, and we're doing them now as opposed to making them part of next year's budget.
That's correct. There are no nice-to-have items included in here.
There's what?
There are no nice-to-have items included in the budget amendment.
Thanks. Mr. City Manager, your view of that?
I agree. If these aren't funded now, I will come back to you and ask for them to be funded in the future. They're all critical items.
Mr. Baruch?
So let me just pick up on Vice Mayor Snyder's point and perhaps put a little bit finer point on it. The way that I'm understanding these and the way that I'm supportive of these public safety items, for example, the sheriff's vehicles, looks like we are replacing some older fleet items, which, Mr. Shields, I understand from your comments, are more expensive, obviously, to maintain than a new vehicle. Stands to reason. The same with the dump trucks, from what you were saying. So I think Mr. Snyder's point is we're capturing essentially two items there. One, there should be some minimal savings on the debt service that's not being issued because we're paying cash, correct?
Correct.
And then two, we're saving on the maintenance, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so I think the third point of that is, given that we're capturing those, I'm expecting that some of those cost savings go back to our taxpayers, that they just don't get sort of folded in and, you know, the money saved goes back into expanded operations, et cetera, that we have a discussion about that there's a way of capturing those savings that don't necessarily go back to the various departments, but we have a public discussion about them.
We can have that discussion because I'm pretty sure that you're going to have a request for more vehicles in next year's budget. And the same issues prevail because there is no equipment replacement fund.
And I know we've talked about that, and I'm very
would hope
supportive.
so.
I'm very supportive of that, rather than just kind of doing these piecemeal, which is how we've been teetering along. So I'd much rather see that approach. So I encourage you to bring it forward again. You'll yet again have my support for it, even if it means putting dollars into that fund, so we don't see these, except if a vehicle is totally like gone into an accident and we can't cover all the insurance, et cetera.
And one thing that I think is very important for the public to understand is we don't have any vehicle replacement built into the tax rate right now. It's all been stripped out. And so the only way to replace vehicles is to use one-time money like this, the way we're structured right now. And so if the money's not used for this purpose, if it's not used at all right now through this budget amendment, it will go to fund balance, and then it would be deployed through the 5-year capital improvements program. That would be the other option for any dollar that's not spent right, under our current structure.
Again, it's a point that I made before, and I'll make it again since we're on the topic. I think this is a really bad way to go. I know that staff doesn't want to go this way. I fully support doing some type of fleet capital improvement program, or whatever we're going to call it. But these one-offs where we have no planning, and it's if there's money, we'll do it. If not, we'll sort of keep doing it, is not a way to do the government budget process, especially with some of these expenditures. I know that on some of the fire apparatus, which are major expenses, we've sort of structured our relationship with Arlington a little bit differently, so there's a built-in replacement. That has pros and cons to that particular item, so I don't want to get into that, but at least we know what's coming in that
Exactly.
arrangement. On this one, we have no idea, and that's just not the way we should be doing municipal budgeting. So I hope that we have a further discussion about it, and I'm just asking that item to fund a fleet maintenance or fleet rejuvenation, whatever we end up calling it, be put into place.
Okay, other comments? Ms. Conley?
So following on Mr. Baruch's question, and this is really about the process of next year's budget. When we do the budget, we often hear it's a 4% increase over the prior year. Will that 4% increase be based upon the original amount of our budget, or will this be added in and then 4% based upon the amended budget amount? If it's 4% or 5%, or how is that figured in next year's budget?
Generally, it's based on the original budget
On
as
the
adopted,
original.
yes.
Okay.
And that's because almost always, as we go through any mid-year budget corrections, it's always for one-time expenditures. It's not kind of built into the base. And similarly, other than the transportation planner position, there's nothing in here that gets built into the base. It's taking care of things sort of on a one-off basis.
Thank you.
Other comments? Mr. Duncan, did you have a comment?
Just to follow on that a little bit, the routinization and regularization of our supplemental appropriations processes, or mid-year corrections, or call it what you will, is something that I think the Budget and Finance Committee would be interested in discussing, and we meet tomorrow night, so I'm happy to add that to the agenda. I agree with everything that's been said previously. I don't believe these expenses, as you listen to the community vibe, are necessarily being questioned as illegitimate. Almost all of them reflect conversations that we've had at some length here, certainly about the vehicle replacement reserve, but also about the desperate need for more attention for neighborhood traffic calming and staff to man that, public safety issues for the sheriff's vehicles, et cetera. It's not so much the items, but it's the process through which they come to us. And, we understand the process, but it's not, immediately transparent, I think, to the average citizen, and there's an equity issue that arises when the schools also have things that they might bring forward in a mid-year correction. At any rate, everybody's working in good faith here. But I do think going forward, and as we approach the November 17th meeting with the school board, it would be useful for us to try to have in mind that we are going to have a budget for the next fiscal year that would be what it is. And then we're going to have a pretty hard-worked and clearly defined list of I'm not going to call them unmet needs because that suggests we're not doing our job. I'm going to call them, next in expenditures. And it would be from that next in list that we would draw when we had the resources to do so and/or saw a compelling need. And I would agree with the Vice Mayor that the taxpayers and their pocketbooks also count as one of those compelling needs. So I would just suggest that perhaps Budget and Finance could talk about this in an introductory way tomorrow night. Thanks.
Mr. Snyder.
Thank you a lot, Mr. Mayor. I support what Councilmember Duncan just said. I do want to look at the process for this sort of review of expenditures after the fiscal year is concluded, and would like a more robust, more understandable process to the community. So that's a great move. And I will be voting on this. However, I vote consistent with the understanding that'll go forward. I want to ask about subsection C, the $597,000 commitment to future development costs. These were building permit fees. Now, I want to ask the city attorney, is there anything as a matter of law that requires us to commit those fees? Those fees go into the general fund, my understanding, but I'm going to ask you as a matter of law, do we need to make this commitment of those fees? It's line 186 of the proposal, and it's subsection C.
No, I'm not aware of anything that requires that you make that commitment.
Okay. As we move forward on the discussion of this tonight, I'm going to recommend that we remove that particular commitment for further discussion, also discussion in light of DMV funding and the school's request. So just FYI, I'll make that motion. It may be seconded, it may not, it may go down, but I feel it's important to raise that particular issue. Thank you.
Okay, are there other questions? This is just questions. We can have comments as well. We're going to call for public comment in just a moment. Just questions. Ms. Conley?
Here, this is another question related to percentages, and I think I know the answer, but if you could confirm it. So we often see that X percent of the budget goes to general government, X percent goes to schools. With the addition of these amended items into the budget, does that change that percentage?
No,
Why not?
because this is only underspending that we're moving around. The total didn't change. We've reallocated a lot of money, and we've,
I thought it was new spending also.
well, there is some new spending in here. But
So
it
that's why
doesn't-
I'm asking, does it change the
Right,
percentage?
it does not change the percentage significantly. We're talking about $1 million out of approximately 38 million in the general fund.
Which, can you do that math fast, is what percentage? 3%?
Less than 3%.
Okay.
Other comments, questions? Well, let's just stick with questions. Why don't we go ahead, if there are no other questions, and open this matter up to the public. Is there any member of the public who wishes to address this item? Seeing none, the matter is closed to the public. Mr. Kalin, would you like to? Yes. This is just on the budget amendment that's before council right now. The water sale is going to be another budget amendment, which is going to be subsequent and separate from this. As if you look at the agenda, it's a separate item. So is there any member of the public who wishes to address this item? Seeing none, the matter is closed to the public. Are there council comments that people would like to make at this point? I would just say, if no one else has any comments, that I continue to have the concerns that I had at our last meeting, that this is moving too quickly. There hasn't been adequate consideration of the items here, that it just needs to slow down and really spend some time on this as we do in the typical budget. I'm concerned this is coming out of order with the other things. A lot of these items appear to be urgent matters, yet they weren't in the budget 4 months ago or 5 months ago, whenever it was we went through it. So I have some concerns on process and substance, which remain. Are there any other comments of council? Do we have a motion, Ms. Oliver?
Could I just ask a question of clarification? Mr. LeCondre, is this a different process than we've done in prior years?
No, it is not.
So in prior years, we've done something similar where around this time of year, we've moved funds around.
Yes.
Thank you.
No, I would say, for one thing, typically we don't take a work session and turn it into a first reading. In other words, this was before the council last week or 2 weeks ago as a work session item, which ended up getting a first reading at that time. So I think this is a bit different than,
This started out as a work session item.
it was a work session item, but at that same meeting, it turned into a first reading.
No, it did not, sir.
Mr. Mayor, I've heard that mentioned before, and my recollection, it really doesn't make any difference. I mean, I think we did bring it up at one work session, and we were not going to resolve it there clearly, and I believe we had a light agenda on the council meeting. At any rate, whatever. What I said earlier stands, which is I'm in agreement that we need a more regularized and routinized and transparent and understandable process to deal with these things going forward. I think ever since I came on to council, these corrections, mid-year, supplementals, whatever you want to call them, have been a source of a lot of questions and some degree of irritation. And we want to set that aside, I think. And it's not because the expenses, I think personally, are not legitimate, or again, that they've not often been discussed, many of them in some detail. But it is true that the community, I think, does not fully understand what it is we're doing, and that's not a good practice. And so, again, I would suggest that we make this one of our priorities as we go forward into the next budget year, before we even start the next budget year, so that we're all of a mindset that we would like to try to avoid this kind of thing, if we can, in the future.
We have a motion.
Mayor, I move to adopt TO 14-29.
Do we have a second?
I second.
Mr. Snyder?
Mr. Mayor, I propose an amendment to delete for further work, subsection C, the $597,000 commitment to future development costs, for further explanation, work on the amounts necessary in what time frame, and for consideration of those amounts in connection with DMV select office funding and further discussion with the schools. So basically, bottom line is delete for now for further discussion, consistent with what I've indicated, subsection C, which is line 186 through 191.
Mr. Duncan?
I have a question about that. Shield, so the purpose of that line item is essentially to put permit fees back into the same office?
No, what it would do is it would commit those funds, so they're no longer a part of unassigned fund balance. And then subject to future appropriation by the city council, those funds would be there to help the city conduct the public safety inspections that the very significant projects that are being built right now will require over the next 3 years. In Arlington County, for instance, they do have an enterprise fund for their building inspection processes. So they might have a year in which they get a lot of receipts, and then because it's all in an enterprise fund, they can manage that so that the costs of conducting those inspections is just naturally handled in that fund. We don't have that type of enterprise fund, so it has to be set aside. If it's not set aside, and we do have higher costs in next year, 2 years from now, then that would just have to come out of the tax rate or out of.
And we'd be
some other
back for a
source of
budget
funds.
amendment.
So you're essentially sort of earmarking the money to be used for this purpose without sort of putting it into an expenditure right now?
That's right. So it's subject to future appropriation by the city council. We could,
But your plan is not to go out and hire staff right now because we don't know what our needs are going to be next year, I hope?
that is correct. We don't have it available to us to do that. We'd have to come back to council and have the council appropriate those funds for that purpose.
So this is not being spent per se, it's just being sort of checked as far as reserving it, but it could get reallocated coming up.
That is correct.
So, just so we're absolutely clear on this, in order to spend this near $600K, you would need to come back to council before it's actually appropriated.
Yes.
So we could say, no, you're not utilizing this money, you're gonna utilize it for, take your pick.
That's right. Council could assign it or appropriate for any purpose, but
Okay.
right now, we're just stating a statement of intent that this is set aside for.
So what I'm going to ask is, and this doesn't need to be part of the motion, staff can do this, that when this comes back in our budget deliberations, that this be an item that's flagged, that there is $597,000 that was earmarked, but that we may choose to reallocate, that it doesn't somehow be interpreted as not showing up when we, except for those of us who have photographic memories, I'm not one of them. I'm probably going to not remember this number, but I'm asking staff to make sure it is flagged and part of the discussion.
Yes.
So,
That would be the intent. We're setting aside this money so that in future budgets.
I get it. Let's
It'll be
be clear
flagged.
about it. It's got to be flagged clearly in a way that's understandable, that it was just a notional idea that sounds good right now, but given that we don't know where the money is, this is almost 2 cents on the tax rate.
If I could interrupt for just a minute, we just need to make sure that if we have a motion to amend the main motion, which is to adopt the ordinance, that gets voted on, and then you know whether you're considering the amended motion or the old one.
Before I figured out what I wanted to do with that motion, I just needed to go through that drill. I wasn't meaning to, yeah.
Ms. Conley, did you have a comment or question about this? Okay, so just to be clear, Ms. McCroskey, we should be voting now on the amendment, whether the council as a group wants to adopt the amendment.
If that was Mr. Snyder's motion, then you should determine whether you have a second and vote on that. So you know
Okay.
what's before you.
So do we have a second on Mr. Snyder's amendment to the motion? Is that a no? Okay, so we do not, so the motion fails for lack of a second. So we have Mr. Duncan's motion on the table. Do we have a second to Mr. Duncan's motion?
Actually, yeah.
Okay, so it's already been seconded.
Sorry, I want to give, I probably jumped the gun now that I think about what Carol just said. I want to make sure that Vice Mayor Snyder has his opportunity so the motion can at least be discussed, even though I sort of jumped in there. So I'll second Vice Mayor Snyder's motion so there can be discussion at least about it.
Okay.
Which I gently got admonished by, I think, by Carol, now that I think about the procedural rules.
Okay, so we do have an amended motion on the table then. And so we will now vote on the amendment, whether the amendment, in fact, will carry. So let's,
You want to call for discussion?
yeah, sure, let's have discussion on the amendment. Is there any discussion on the amendment? Ms. Conley?
So that amount in section C of $597,000, that came from developers of our two projects that are underway right now. It is being earmarked specifically for developers for
For
us to
future
work
inspections for
of
those
that
developments.
development. So that particular item really shouldn't be combined with DMV concerns or school concerns. That should really be separated,
Council can do
whatever we want with it.
what it likes, but what we were suggesting when we asked that these funds be earmarked was to pay for the inspection services in the future. We collect revenue today, but the inspections themselves may not happen for 2 or 3 years.
Right.
At that point, you're going to need money to fund that. That's the purpose of setting aside this money.
So like Mr. Brook, I'd like to see that flagged somehow, the pink highlight or something.
And that's the intent.
Okay, is there other discussion about the amendment?
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, if I might, I do want to reiterate that it's 2 cents on the tax rate. It's highly speculative as to how much we're going to need for this. What we do know is we've got a DMV Select Office that has a lot of support in the community that is going to be cut, and the schools have come to us, and it seems to me that this is a classic situation where you're basically creating an earmarking a lot of money with no proof that it's needed when it's needed, and we've got other needs that should compete. Not that we won't do necessary inspection services, but this is, I've never seen anything like this before that we've done. It seems to me it's artificially segmenting money and then creating an artificial scarcity that affects other community services. So it seems to me this is an area that deserves a lot more attention on the part of City Council before we do this. So that's why I suggested removing it. The proof may be that we need exactly this amount of money, we need less, we need more within the time frame, but we've never done this before with regard to this approach. And as a legal matter, we don't have to spend all the permit fees or set them aside as we're doing. This is a recommendation from management, and one which because of the size of it and because of other needs that I think deserve attention, that's why I'm making the motion. Thanks.
Yeah, I share some of those concerns, but what I'm also hearing, I guess what I wouldn't want to see happen with the 597,000 is that there's some other amendment that comes forward before the budget period and starts, diving into this amount of money. I think it makes sense to flag it for now. We could choose to put it back into the budget mix and not allocate all the monies the way that's being proposed. But I also don't want to open the door for the $600,000 to get spent today either on some other item that hasn't come before us. So that's how I'm viewing it, is this just merely puts a little asterisk by it, and then we'll have a discussion about it in the budget season.
Mr. Z?
Thank you, Mayor. It would appear to me that the 597 is shown here on page 344 as reserved for future development cost 19, line 19. Now that clashes very well with subsection C, lines 186 to 191. My fear, if this amendment is approved, is that it puts that money into play. It brings it back into this current budget, and that with that additional amount of money, I don't know that council has the proper financial oversight and stewardship to resist spending that money on things that just happen to come along. It rightfully belongs in the enterprise fund for inspections and review of future development costs. And if we choose to do differently, we should do that as an item of special note and not just bring it back into play tonight. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other comments, or should we go ahead and vote on the amendment to the motion? So that, Ms. McCroskey, what we will do a roll call vote on now is the amendment to the motion, correct? Okay,
Yeah.
so let's go ahead, unless there are any other comments, let's go ahead and take a roll call vote, Madam Clerk.
Mr. Baruch?
No.
Ms. Conley?
No.
Mr. Duncan?
No.
Ms. Oliver?
No.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Z?
No.
Mayor Tarter?
No. Okay, so now we have Mr. Duncan's motion on the table, which has a second. And so we will now vote on that motion. Okay, unless there's any further discussion or comment. Okay, Madam Clerk, will you call the roll call vote on Mr. Duncan's amendment, or Mr. Duncan's motion?
Mr. Mayor, just quickly to explain my vote in support of this, there's a lot in here that I think is justified, especially in terms of public safety. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll call vote on the motion
Yes.
at the table?
Mr. Baruch?
Yes.
Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Z?
Yes.
Mayor Tarter?
No. Motion carries.
And the motion carries.
Thank you very much. Madam Clerk, will you call the next item, please?
We have TO 1430, ordinance to amend ordinance TO 1429 regarding the budget of expenditures and revenues appropriating funds for fiscal year 2015 for the general fund using water sale proceeds to fully fund, based on actuarial valuation, the pension fund up to $10 million, and with the remainder of the $20,500,000 committed to capital reserves, 85% of which shall be allocated to capital projects that will have a useful life of at least 20 years, and 15% which may be used for more immediate capital needs without restriction.
Mr. Shields?
Thank you, Mayor Tarter, members of council. I have prepared tonight to to go through a brief presentation. Many of the same slides that the council has seen a number of times on the project, just a few of them updated to reflect these final numbers. And I'd like to, I won't go through it in a very slow way because I know the council has seen it on multiple times and many people in the public have as well, but I think just for the final action, if it's the council's pleasure, I will do that and just to help with the discussion. What's before the council on second reading is the allocation of the water sale proceeds, as the clerk noted. The net proceeds are $20.5 million, and that comes after taking care of all of our obligations in the water fund. This action tonight also will be accompanied by a resolution to amend the city's pension plans. If this budget allocation is adopted, then the resolution to amend the pension plans would lay out how this money would then be treated in the pension plan, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. I would note the council has had numerous meetings on this topic. I counted 11 public meetings on the use of the water sale proceeds. It's been a very deliberate effort with consultation with outside experts as well as staff and a lot of listening to the community. The council laid out some direction over a year ago, and this direction really has guided the discussion in its broad parameters as the council has looked for the highest and best use of of the water sale proceeds for the long-term benefit of the city and its taxpayers. And there are two basic approaches. One is direct investment in city projects. The benefit there is you avoid debt service for needed capital infrastructure in the city. And when you do that, you get, for the taxpayer's perspective, you get a 20-year benefit because we typically issue 20-year term bonds for our major capital projects. And then once that 20-year hypothetical bond, which is would be used, using the water sale proceeds instead of that bond, once that 20-year period is over, then the direct benefit to the taxpayer in a budgetary sense, what would show up on the tax rate, would go away. And so the council has looked for ways to provide a perpetual or a long-term return on investment of principal. And one of the great challenges of doing that is the things that cities are eligible or allowed to invest in are very low yield. Traditional bonds, half a percentage point, to a longer term bond, right now a maximum of a 3.5% return. The pension fund, on the other hand, presents an opportunity to earn a higher return. 7.5% has been our historical average, and accounting for good years and bad, so that's the long-term average. And then that benefit is realized by the taxpayers through a reduction in our costs for the pension fund, a reduction in the annual required contribution. What's before the council is an allocation where there's two basic pieces to it. $9.2 million is the unfunded actuarial liability in the pension fund as of June 30th, 2014. And so this budget amendment would allocate $9.2 million to be placed in the pension fund, and the remainder placed in capital reserves, 85% of which would be used for long-term projects that have a life of 20 years or longer, and 15% would be used for more immediate capital needs that might not have that 20-year requirement associated with it. Taking a look at the return on investment of the direct investment in infrastructure versus investing in the pension fund, the blue line represents a 30-year return on investment from a tax rate or a taxpayer's perspective of a hypothetical $1 million of investment. And so in years 1 through 20, essentially, the taxpayer gets about an 8.5% return on that $1 million invested in direct capital. For the hypothetical $1 million, that would be $85,000. And the investment in the pension fund, a 7.5% long-term average return. slightly lower in year 1 through 20, but the benefit is in the out years that this is a perpetual benefit that, again, will vary from year to year, and we will smooth that out through using smoothing techniques, so we won't have a lot of variability, ideally, in the budget, and over the long term can expect to have a decent yield. Why fully fund the pension? A, it's required by law. B, it will reduce the city's operating costs. Currently, those are $3.6 million per year in total costs for schools and police for the city-run pension plans. That's not including VRS. It will improve the city's credit rating and make debt cheaper for the city. And again, it gives a higher return than the other options available to us. A couple of facts. Our teachers are in the Virginia retirement system, and so what we're talking about are the non-teacher employees in the school system, police, and then all other city employees are in our city plans. The pension fund is invested in U.S. equities. It's invested in U.S. fixed income instruments. 14% of it is international developed markets. A smaller percentage, 3%, is in international emerging markets, 4% is in REITs, and the remainder is in cash or other cash equivalents in the pension fund. And $9.2 million is the recommended allocation based on the unfunded actuarial liability. So the way that this can work, taking both, if you take the savings from the annual required contribution to the pension fund and dedicate that solely to capital, and also have the $11 million to cash fund projects that would otherwise be funded through debt, you can take our debt service projections, which with our adopted capital improvements program are projected to increase by $3 million over the next 5 years, and that does not include funding for the high school, but that includes funding for the $37 million of other infrastructure that's planned in our capital improvements program. And you can reduce that to about a $1.6 million increase in debt service costs and flatten that line out considerably. We will, as we consider every capital project, we will always look for ways to reduce its costs. We will structure the debt in ways that are financially sustainable, but also will help mitigate these costs. But just comparing apples to oranges, by deploying the sale proceeds as laid out in this budget amendment, we can significantly reduce our capital costs. A couple of additional points. We do think it is wise to keep a significant portion of the sale proceeds and in our capital reserves. Right now is a favorable lending environment for municipal debt. Current interest rates are at historic lows. We expect that interest rates will go up in the future, and that and the water sale proceeds can then be deployed to maximum advantage for the taxpayers in the future. The council has been discussing options for the Mount Daniel expansion and how to fund it. That's a $15.6 million project to expand Mount Daniel. $1 million of bonds were issued last year, and $14.6 million will need to be financed if the voters approve that next Tuesday. So in the base case, the debt service for the project would be about $1.1 million per year. We've considered other options, and if you take that base case and if you take what the long-term average return of the yield of the investment in the pension fund and the reduction of the ARC, and if that's dedicated to capital, as has been our intent, that would reduce the cost of the Mount Daniel project to $430,000. We've also discussed developer proffers and applying those to the Mount Daniel project. We think the timing will essentially sync up and make that feasible. The Tenor Hill proffers are expected in spring 2016, and the Harris Teeter proffers are expected in the spring of 2016 as well, both of them at the same time. So for a total of $4.2 million in developer school capital cost contributions were deployed to the Mount Daniel project, then that could reduce the cost of the debt service along with the savings and pension cost that are then assigned to capital. It could reduce that down to about $200,000 a year. This will be, how we fund Mount Daniel will be subject to a later discussion and decision by the City Council if the voters approve it. But this is just to show that the examples that have been under public discussion as options that are available to the city. In summary, the council has laid out from the beginning over this year-long discernment process about the best use of these funds to seek a long-term benefit, and what is before the council is $11.3 million allocated for direct investment in capital projects and $9.2 million for investment in the city's pension plans. This is a list of the meetings that we've held on this topic. 6 work sessions over the course of the year and 5 public presentations. A great deal of thought and effort and energy in between those meetings as we've responded to questions and to additional ideas. And so a lot of work has gone into this. And a lot of work, if the council takes this action tonight, it really sets the stage for a lot of work going forward because we're not laying out exactly with this action how the direct investment in capital would work. That would happen over a planful period in the development of our capital improvements program to then have that $11.3 million assigned to those projects that will make the biggest impact for the taxpayers and the services we provide and use the money most wisely. So that's a summary, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Shields. Any questions from council? And maybe we'll save comments till after we hear from the public, but any questions from council now? Mr. Duncan, do you have a question or some?
Could I just start with one? It's pretty clear that Mount Daniel itself could be covered in whole or almost in whole. Could you go back to the slide where you talk about the other capital, the $37 million there? Because the questions that you get are, if we spend this bullet on Mount Daniel, how are we going to handle all the other things that are coming up down the road? And you've answered this, but I think could you be just a little more specific? The projects that we anticipate coming to us are City Hall in some form, the library in some form, and what other large projects, and then the high school. And the resources that you're showing here that are provided through this use of proceeds would help cushion the cost of any and all of those. Is that, we could put it all into one, or we could spread it across 2 or 3? I mean, we have options that will help us cushion the cost of these future large capital projects. Is that correct to say?
That is correct. And with every project first gets put in the CIP, and we take it, we always model it in what is frankly generally the most expensive way you could do it, which and then we, as we get closer to the projects, we look for ways to handle them and manage them in the most effective way given our circumstances at that time. And so I think this is a reasonable projection of what our debt service will be without having gone through all of the extra diligence that we do whenever we get closer to any bond issuance.
Okay, I'm voicing the questions that were sent to us by Mr. Castillo of the school board, which are good questions. The first ones are ones that we have covered well and thoroughly during our year-long process after a bull market, what equities, basically speaks to market timing, what degree of certainty are about their year-to-year returns. We're well briefed on those questions, but his question, 2 at the end, are what's the city's long-term plan for capital expenditures, and how would the $20.5 million or other amount of water fund proceeds enable, cripple these plans? I'm going with the, affect positively and help enable as the answer to his question there. And then what is the city's ultimate borrowing capacity and how would it be affected by this action? Nowhere up there does it show any bonded effort that would exceed our 12% of expenditures effort. Is that true?
That is true, although the high school is not on here. And so in the projections that the council looked at just a month ago, we did have the initial payments for the high school in our projections. And I didn't include them in this graph just because there's so many variables still at play with the high school that we want to work through with the steering committee, very importantly, before we really start to model that.
Understood. And then the Budget and Finance Committee is going to talk about this, I think, some more tomorrow night. We have the beginnings of projections through FY 2020, and Mr. LeCondre tells me that those numbers do include a $40 million tranche of debt for the high school. And the numbers, at least, that were tentatively shown to me and that we're going to hear in detail tomorrow night show that our debt percentage would still be below 10% in FY 2020, even with that commitment to the beginning of the high school project. Thanks.
Ms. Oliver?
I just have a question of clarification, and I may be splitting hairs on grammar, but my recollection of the discussion that we had at the work session was that at least 85% should go towards capital projects, and up to 15% could be used towards other capital needs with no further restrictions. And I think that I just wanted to be clear that the wording we have in the resolution really fully captures that without those words. To me, that was just a very important distinction.
Ms. Oliver, you pointed out that the resolution doesn't seem to use the word at least, or up to and at least. Because I seem to, my reading of it, I didn't see those words in there, but I may have misread it.
I do think that was the intent, and so I think that the addition of those two words would express the council's intent at first reading. I think what we did was we took it directly from the motion, and so I think the council could amend that to reflect those words, because I think that does reflect what the discussion was.
I believe I made the motion and I had those words in there, and then there had been some discussion about whether they were necessary. But I just wanted to make it clear because I thought that was an important distinction. I think even as it's phrased, that flexibility is there.
My recollection of the first reading was, in fact, as yours was, that you made an amendment. We modified the language to be at least, and at least 85% and up to 15%. Was in the language that I understood to be approved at first reading. I don't know if anyone else has any other recollection.
I do recall it that way. So if we were to make that change, would it be at line 82 and 86? Is that where you're speaking?
It would be at line 179 and line 183.
Sorry.
So in other words, don't amend the staff report,
I'm sorry.
amend the actual order.
Sorry. looking at the wrong page.
If I could, while people are looking at that, make a disclosure, and I think Ms. Conley may wish to make one as well. I'd be happy to let you go first if you'd like. The transaction for the City Council is the adoption of an ordinance to appropriate approximately $9.2 million from the city's water sale proceeds to the city's pension funds. Because my wife is an employee of the Falls Church City Schools, that family member may be vested in the city's retirement system, although I believe it's the VRS system that she's actually is not. Anyway, however, I'm a member of a business, professional group of 3 or more persons that the member of which are affected by this action, and I'm able to participate in this transaction fairly objectively in the public interest. Ms. Conley?
So with regard to this item, the transaction before City Council is the adoption of an ordinance to appropriate $9.2 million from the city's water sale proceeds to the city pension funds. For 8 years, I was a part-time employee of Falls Church City Schools, and because of that, I invested in the city's retirement system. Therefore, I'm a member of a business, profession, or group of 3 or more persons, the members of which are affected by the transaction, and I'm able to participate in this transaction fairly objectively and in the public interest.
Thank you. Do we have other questions? Mr. Snyder?
I do. Thanks a lot, Mr. Mayor. Couple of questions. First of all, I have consistently asked for legal opinions on this subject. I asked it from the prior city attorney. I've asked for independent legal advice. And I would ask our current city attorney to make a statement regarding the legality of this proposal. That is, the proposal to put the money into the pension system and use the money as we've talked about here.
I've reviewed this and provided a written opinion to council, and I've concluded that the proposed use of the water sale proceeds for the pension fund is permissible under Virginia law. And in addition, there are opinions of outside counsel that have advised that it is consistent with pension law and tax law to make this use of the funds.
Thank you very much. Part of my due diligence in looking at this was to establish as clear a legal foundation as possible. Second question I have is the projections on the return, because after all, the major argument for putting the money in the pension system as opposed to putting the money directly into capital projects is the rate of return. How recently has the projected 7.5% been validated in view of recent stock market fluctuations?
It has been validated for the long-term historical averages. And so if you take the 25-year investment returns, it's just over 8%. If you take the last 10 years average returns, they've been 7.5%. And so that includes obviously the great deal of market turmoil in the past decade. We do think that going forward, we have tried to model this in that 7 to 7.5% returns, and we do that with the full knowledge that the past is no reliable predictor of the future. It's the best way we can model it, but things can change. And we also respect the fact that that in terms of our projections on an actuarial basis going forward, we will use a discount rate of 7% for our forecast for the future that just reflects what I think many people in the industry think is a reasonable expectation for the future.
Okay, thank you. Next question. While 7% looks like a good return today, there have been cases where interest rates have been 10 and up to 13, 14, 15%. Then does the 7% will reflect that in some way, or we're going to be at 7% where interest rates are at 15%?
When you get into an interest rate environment such as you've described, the types of investments in the pension fund are, I think, a reasonable hedge against a high interest rate environment as well. And so our financial advisor and investment advisor has, I think, has that type of a situation in mind in terms of the risk portfolio for the pension investments as well.
Okay. Next question. This is potentially variable from year to year. How are we going to manage the variability from year to year? It could be a lot more than 7% some years and a lot less other years. So how are we going to manage that so we don't spend it one year and then have a deficit the next year?
The way that we would propose to do that is that in any given year, and the short answer is we would use 5-year smoothing of our investment returns. And so what that means is that in any given year, you take 20% of the gains or the losses to determine what your return would be for that year. That's the way we handle the smoothing of our assets for the $100 million that are in the pension fund, so that the city's annual required contribution doesn't yo-yo up and down significantly. And so it's a common practice. It's used by most pension funds. Our actuaries are very used to it. So we think that's a good way to manage that variability that will necessarily come with the investments that the pension fund is in.
Okay, next question. What are the mechanics of this? Do we just write a check for to the pension system for $9.2 million? Is it done over time? How is the actual payment done?
Well, what we would propose is that the council would make the allocation, and then we would work with our professional investment advisor to enter the market in a way that will look out for the city's interests based on the best information that we have. One thing that I would note is that this is not new for our pension managers either. Every year, we put new money into the fund, and that money gets invested over time based on the best advice of our investment professionals. So this money would be handled in that similar fashion.
So finally, if all the investment estimates turn out to be wrong, and actuaries have been wrong, look at the financial crisis, we've still put money into something we have to fund anyway, right? So what assure the public that this is money that's not going to get lost?
It is a legal obligation to meet these pension expenses, and so if there are market losses, the money in the fund will help mitigate those for the taxpayers of the city in any event. So I think that's the short answer to your question. If I think in our analysis of this option, we've always tried to rank the probabilities. And in April, when we discussed this with the retirement board, they laid out with professional help some of the probabilities of, what's the 50th percentile likely outcome, what is the 75% likely outcome, based on the best information that we had. And if you use the 5-year smoothing techniques, if you take investment returns going back as long as we have data for it, we think that this investment over the long term will provide a positive yield for the taxpayers of the city.
Thank you.
Are there other questions? Mr. Baruch?
Thank you. One other question that's come up. This is on the city's legal obligation. As I understand it, with the pension system, if we were to change to a different contribution system, for example, one that was not defined, and moved into what most industry, et cetera, are now doing rather than a straight-up defined pension system, the obligations that we have for our current employees would still remain. Is that right?
Yes, to vested employees.
Vested employees, which, according to the city's plan, how many years does it take to vest?
5 years.
5 years. So those would continue for employees that have been on for 5 years or more. So we couldn't suddenly pivot and forgo those obligations. I guess we could, but there would be a big payout that we would have to do.
That's right. I have not looked at this just recently, but I believe that's right. You don't have an obligation necessarily to give a pension to somebody who's vested but hasn't met all the requirements, in other words, hasn't retired yet. However, you would have to pay back all the money that's been put in there on their behalf.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, why don't we open it up to the public? Did you have a question, Ms. Conley?
Two questions. One is on just the 15%, which may be used for immediate capital needs without restriction. Based upon our previous discussion about budget, it seems like we have just questions about the process of how money is actually spent. So what is the understanding of how are we going to determine that the spending of that $1.5 million?
My interpretation of the language is that it also would go through that capital improvements program, and that's where these decisions would be made. And so shall be used towards other capital needs. We do define capital projects in the city, and so that's a project that has a cost of at least $150,000 and has a life expectancy of, is it 5 years or 10 years? Of 10 years. And so it's a looser definition, but there, that word capital in our CIP language does have meaning associated with it.
Okay. So then it would come before council during the CIP process. We would be able to deliberate, the public would be able to give input. And
that is
It
correct.
would be decided as part of a process.
That is correct.
Not just, without restriction just doesn't mean as people feel like it.
That is correct. And also they would, what we're envisioning is that this is a process in which all of the city's needs are considered at once, and, through the capital planning process, it would not be, one-off types of ideas typically, unless something was extremely meritorious. But the process as envisioned is through our capital improvements program.
Okay. And I also have a question for Mr. LeCondre, and that is, I asked this at the work session last week, how are we going to account for the money that is not paid into the ARC, which is now in operating expenses that will now be moved to capital? How are we going to show that in the budget so that it doesn't get lost?
I believe I said that it would be in the budget narrative. As we put the budget together, we always provide you with a narrative of what was being done in the budget that would be included. In other words, it would be the amount of savings that were generated because of the lowered.
And that will go on for perpetuity? There'll be a budget narrative, or how will we know in 20 years?
Every year it'll be in your budget.
Every year there's going to be a narrative. It's not going to be a line item? It's going to be a...
Well, the line item is going to be the pension costs, so there won't be a line item to show you how much you saved. It'll be in the narrative. That's what I envision.
If I could jump in, I actually think it would be good to show it in some form or the other in the line item, whether it's, an add in, add out sort of thing, but I think that would make it easier for people to follow where this money trail is going to be.
That'll be
in
fine.
perpetuity.
Thank you. That is, I think, would be easier to see in the future as we go forward.
Okay.
As we're looking at line items, or as people 20 years from now are looking at line items, it'll be there.
Hang on. Ms. Oliver, then Mr. Duncan, then Mr. Baruch.
Sorry, I'd just like to go back to Ms. Connolly's first point. As the resolution is currently written, it's very clear that the at least 85% will go through the capital improvement program, and the up to 15% shall be used for other capital needs with no further restrictions. There's nothing that says that that will go through the capital improvement program, and I believe that that was the intention, that it may go through the capital improvement program, but it not have to go through the capital improvement program.
Okay, well, thank you for that clarification of intent. So that corrects what I said earlier, because I think there is a distinction there, yeah.
If I could add something, I know we get some more questions, just clarification on a point that was just raised. We were just talking about 10 years for a capital item. Some of the things we've discussed, and this isn't a full discussion, we haven't had a full discussion, but the idea of maybe fixing up the downtown, sprucing up the downtown, some of those items occur to me, they may not be 10-year life. For example, I don't know if there's painting, for example, involved. Would those be considered capital, or kind of where would all that break out, and would we be restricting ourselves on what we might be able to do with this money?
Maybe I would, to express the intent that was just stated, at line 183, if it read, up to 15% or 1.7 million shall be used towards other strike capital and say one-time needs with no further restrictions. The word capital means something to me. It may not to others. And so one time would make it clear that there really aren't restrictions on this, other than, since it's one-time money, it would not be for ongoing operating needs, which is in the council's policies anyway.
Ms. Connolly, then Mr. Duncan, then Mr. Baruch.
So then which budget process would these one-time needs be considered under?
It could either be through the capital improvement program or just through the operating budget.
Right. We do have a line for capital outlay in your operating budget. It could go there, and that would be the preference.
Mr. Duncan?
By doing that, that doesn't require us, obviously, to spend 1.7 because the wording is going to be up to 15% or 1.7 million shall be used. That does suggest that at least $1 shall be used, but, we're not locking ourselves in to spend $1.7 million on one-time needs, just to be clear about that. But my question, if I think maybe this broadens it just a little bit, but not too much, I hope, on lines 19 and 20 of the budget chart, appropriation of funds chart. Of course, are going to show 11.3 million and 9.2 million, and our total general fund budget, all of a sudden, you know, because of action here tonight, jumps from what it is to more than 100 million. Some of that money, though, is in and out pretty quickly, right? I mean, the pension fund money. Well, don't let me presuppose the answer to this question. There are things that we take off of when we look at the total general fund number. There are certain percentages that, you know, whether it's unassigned fund balance or whatever that we go off on. Is there any impact of the total general fund budget of the City of Falls Church jumping from what it is today to more than 100 million that we haven't thought about or should discuss?
Not that I can think of. Again, if you're concerned about a council guidance that said the budget shall grow 3%, we wouldn't be talking about 3% of 102 million. We'd be talking about 3% of what the original adopted budget was.
Okay, and that would be the case in the upcoming budget year, but once we began to deploy some of these monies, then it could factor into future years' budgets from what you're saying. Is that the case?
No, not when you talk about reserves. I mean, you're talking about $20 million in reserves, and you're not going to do that every year.
Okay, I think that answers enough for right now, but we'll talk about it a little bit more tomorrow night at our budget finance.
I mean, you're not going to grow the reserve at 3% next year.
Okay.
Mr. Baruch?
Thank you. Just, you know, I had misgivings about the 15% or 1.7 million being applied towards capital, because I just thought that would lead to sort of a free-for-all, and now we're striking out potentially capital, which would make it even more free-for-all. So I think given that we're fully funding the pension, I'm still generally okay with where we're headed, and I'm not asking for a motion to be made on this or it amended, because I think it's just going to drag this process out. But I just like my fellow council members and staff to be cognizant of the way that I'm viewing the up to, or however we're putting that language in for the 1.7 million, that's really to be directed towards items that are going to be helping with some of our economic initiatives and economic redevelopment of our various areas. So I'm not looking at bring us your, you know, pet projects. So just want to put it out there for the community and my fellow council members. That's not what I'm looking for this $1.7 million to be used for. If we're talking seriously about, you know, doing something with municipal parking and doing private-public partnerships with our business community, improving certain areas and using this seeding money to do that, that's something I could be in favor of. But if it's sort of like other things that I can't really think of right now because that's not where my mind is, that's just, I just want to put it out there. This is, you know, in my view, to be used towards really trying to focus in on some improving our business districts and trying to capitalize on this money, if you will, rather than just figuring out a way of spending it just because we have the need. What I'm looking at is figuring out where there may be areas of input of public money into infrastructure that can then help ways of reducing the tax rate in the long term, even for a small amount of 1.7 million. That's what I'm looking for, is that this is going to have returns as we move forward.
Okay, other questions? Why don't we go ahead then and open it up to the public, and then we can have council comments and take a vote. Mr. Kalin, would you like to speak? Pardon? Would you like to speak? I-
To spend an evening at the city council ruminating with my old colleagues. Thank you, Ira Kalin, 429 Park Avenue. I'd like to talk to actually two things, but we'll spend most of it on the proceeds use. As presented, I think it is a very good proposal. I think it was very thoughtful and does capture the idea of maintaining the use of the proceeds for the longest possible terms usage. So I'd like to very actively support the proposal. The issues that I think Ms. Oliver and Mr. Brook have mentioned are very important. You wouldn't want this to be converted into a free-for-all, and the longer the term investment, the better it is in terms of the use of the proceeds. One of the things that's come up is that a number of people think, for whatever reason, that this is a prepayment of the pension. As been come out here, this is not a prepayment. This is for obligations already incurred. An example could be provided to those who broach that is if you're a month late on your mortgage payment and then you pay up the next month and you're current, I would like to see that person go to their mortgage company and tell them they want credit for a prepayment. You can see what the response is from them. So it's not. As to the volatility of the markets, this $10 million is no different than the market volatility that the other $90 million that we have experienced. This is nothing unique about it. So if we manage that capably, there's no reason to believe the last $10 million won't be capably managed as well. And big funds, where I used to work, has a $5.4 billion fund, and they work through the same volatility that affects all the other institutions that have defined benefit. There's different investment strategies, but there's nothing unique about this. In terms of that, I think last year the city's retirement fund earned between 14 and 17%. I think it was closer to 17%. This year it'll be a lot lower, maybe let's say 3%, but the average of the two is certainly above the 7.5%. You just can't chase the market. You can't chase it year to year. That's why they have smoothing. If one wants to go broke, just take your personal finances and try to guess market movements year to year, and you'll be in very interesting financial straits very quickly. Good proposal. I would like to recommend that the council proceed and approve it as presented. And for the record, the first comments on this were provided by a council member publicly on how to use the proceeds of the sale, a suggestion in February of 2012. So this is not exactly a brand new concept. It's been a bit of a, as the Beatles song says, a long and winding road, but it seems like we're coming to a decent conclusion. To the attorney, I'm not sure what you were referring to wouldn't be for defined contribution, where the employer has rights that are different than for defined benefit. In defined contribution, if my pension law is correct, the sponsor can terminate the program or can buy an annuity that replaces what their future payments would have been. I'm unsure that acquired benefits in a defined benefit can be terminated unilaterally by the sponsor. That's something I happen to be a little bit familiar with those issues. Secondly, moving totally away from this, which is I just think a wonderful idea, is the issue that's come up vis-a-vis the lack of internal controls in the city and in the school division. We have been notified by our auditor for the last 2 years and probably this year that we have significant deficiencies in the segregation of duties between really the person who authorizes an expenditure and the person who actually disperses. That lack of internal controls and that exposure means that the city is subject to the risk and vulnerability of mistakes, fraud, and embezzlement. This is not uncommon. Don't think for a second that we're free of that in Falls Church City. I'm not telling you anybody here, we don't know who will come. And when there's large sums of money involved, you will be amazed at the creativity of individuals to work around the system. This is a big deal. I did a FOA. It was actually the result of our work session when we were talking about monies that were allocated by the school division for the architectural studies that went to RTKL, I think is the name of the firm. Well, it came out that that was a firm that was now owned by Arcadis. And then I remember that Arcadis also did Cherry Street. Arcadis also had done, had been the intermediary for the feasibility study to move Mount Daniel to City Hall. So I asked the schools to please provide an indication of how many contracts Arcadis has received in the last few years. And they produced all the purchase orders, and it comes to about $1 million in work that the city or the school division has worked with Arcadis, about $1 million. And I was looking through the purchase orders, and I noticed that the person who authorized it also was the same person who dispersed it. Well, that's a problem. This has nothing to do with the individual involved. This is a process procedure. I'm not questioning the integrity of anyone. But by doing that, fraud could take place if that person authorized an expenditures for work that hasn't been done, or is involved in some sort of relationship with, or the work was partially done but it wasn't supervised. They don't know, so it gets signed, and the city doesn't get everything that it paid for. Or you have embezzlement, in which there is no company, it's a fake company, monies are dispersed to the fake company, and then that individual gets it. And that happens frequently. I said, before you respond, Dave.
No, I just wanted to say that I think you're probably 3 minutes is probably come and gone. If you could wrap it up, coming up, we'd appreciate it. I don't know if the clerk's
Well,
been
okay.
taking-
Plausible deniability is gone now, okay? You've been told, and I think the city attorney, you may want to ask the city attorney what your legal exposure is. Now that it's been explained and made clear, if fraud and embezzlement take place after the council has been notified that this is an issue, what is your exposure? That's the 3 minutes.
I'm sorry. Don't come get me. All right. Thank you. My apologies. I tell you, I am sorry. My apologies to you.
You didn't want to hear what I was saying.
No, I'm fine hearing what you have to say. And I tell you, if you'd like to finish, you've got another, we'll give you a couple more seconds.
I mean, this is like a timeout mistake in a football game.
It is
I get
indeed.
to replay the last 3 seconds.
My apologies to you, sincerely. Thank you for coming up and speaking tonight. We appreciate it. Is there anyone else who would like to speak to this matter tonight? Okay. Ms. Jones, welcome.
I just want to clarify, Arcadis is actually a construction management firm, and it is a firm that we have a legal contract with. We have with any contract that we've ever done with them. And in a small school division, I handle all of our construction, and so it is absolutely essential that we have a construction management firm that accounts for every single penny that is spent. And I definitely attribute very much so that the cost savings we had at Mary Ellen Henderson, which was almost $500,000, cost savings we had at Thomas Jefferson, very much attributed to having a construction management firm. And I just want to make sure that that's very clear, that it's not a firm that we just do side little contracts with. It's done legally, and it absolutely is essential for the school division. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Is there anyone else who wishes to address council on this matter? Seeing none, the matter is closed to the public and now with council. Are there any council comments? Should we start with a motion and then go to council comments?
Yes, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, yes, what would you like to?
I would like to make a motion. I'd like to move to conduct public hearing, grant second reading, and adopt ordinance TO 14-30 with the language revised to reflect at line 179 the phrase "at least 85% or $9.6 million, etc." And at line 183, up to 15% or $1.7 million shall be used towards other one-time needs with no further restrictions.
Do we have a second?
I second that.
Okay, and now for discussion. Is there any discussion that people would like to make? Any comments that anyone would like to make as to this motion? Mr. Z?
Thank you, Mayor. This ordinance on its face seems reasonable, just as it would appear reasonable that at this time there is no real requirement to bring it forward. There's nothing that is so urgent that we have to resolve this tonight. So why do this now? Why not put this issue to test during the budget process? For those that have asked me that question, I don't really have a good answer for them. But they do remind me that people need to be informed on the big picture, the long-term plan. What do we pay for with cash in hand? What do we bond? And what do we defer? Now, earlier in the process, I was made aware that GASB 67, General Government Accounting Standards Board Statement 67 and 68, identified items such as unfunded pensions as a liability that would be assessed against all the term sheets of every municipality and state in the United States. I was assuaged to learn that this would not happen just to us, but for everybody, and the way I saw it was that a outflowing tide lowers all the boats. We would not necessarily be damaged any more than anyone else. And finally, the question on how much do we expect on return on investment? I've also heard it say, let's just do it and hope for the best. The city manager and others on staff have tried to tell us that they can smooth it. The 10-year return is one thing, the 25-year return is also seems reasonable, but at the end of all this is reliance on hope. And hope is not a strategy. Now, without an adequate foundation given for these assumptions on the returns, it's been made known to me that only a handful of municipalities have fully funded their pensions. I certainly understand the desire to spend the people's money to solve a pension problem, and to do so while long-term interest rates are low. And certainly the city manager's presentation tonight shows us the path forward is to fund this to allow us to borrow at low rates to satisfy and fund the city's great demand for civic and educational facilities in the next few years. Along with the people's desire for information, over 2 of these sessions that the city manager has identified, I've asked for a list of what we have bonded. What was the scope? When do we start? When are they going to be paid up? What the rates are? I've yet to see that list. I cannot present to the people in this community without being provided that list, and I ask for it again now. Secondly, fully funding this pension means that we would, again, defer the discussion on whether we can have a discussion about defined contributions, whether we can talk about a hybrid plan, whether we need to look at a 401k or a 403b plan that provides a vehicle for the staff of the city to have options. And finally, in the last year, I learned we have all kinds of little buckets, like under a leaky roof. I know other council members have asked for clarity on those buckets, whether they be called ready reserves, funds subject to fund balance policy, unallocated capital funds, underspent general funds set aside for priority projects, enterprise funds set aside, and there are probably a few more buckets I haven't managed to touch on. But that's where I am tonight. So notwithstanding all this discussion that's occurred since last winter, and even earlier on this topic, I'm not prepared to affirm spending this money at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Z. Other members of council wish to speak? Mr. Duncan?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to agree with Mr. Baruch, who said at the work session that we've pretty well talked this one into a corner. So I just want the record to show my appreciation for the help that we've gotten and the work that's been done to enable council to address this issue in a deliberate and measured way. Specifically, Vice Mayor Snyder's efforts to make sure we're on solid legal ground, and Connie Rydberg and the Retirement Board's considerable efforts to educate and explain and assure us of the pension option as a prudent investment. One of the most difficult votes I cast early in my council tenure was to sell the water system. Wasn't too keen on the idea. I liked the notion of Little Falls Church projecting out into our metropolitan region, but the water system was not a sustainable business enterprise for the city for reasons that we all know. When I voted to sell it, it was my fervent hope that the proceeds from that sale could go to some real and permanent good for the city of Falls Church, just as the water system had been a performing asset for the city for decades. Tonight, I do need to say that the amount of money we're talking about here, $20.5 million, exceeds my wildest expectations when I voted to sell the water system. I am extremely pleased that we were able to realize that amount of money from the sale and to secure the land on which our high school and middle school sit for future educational and development purposes. I think it's a very significant win, and the allocation of those proceeds to, because the proceeds are so considerable, the ability to allocate them in basically a couple of ways also gives me great satisfaction. The return on principal that we would get and the direct investment that we could make in other projects will, as I mentioned earlier, I think enable us to tackle the most shovel-ready capital project that's in front of us at effectively no new cost to the taxpayers, and will enable us through the decade, as long as we exercise appropriate restraint in operation spending and continue to pursue an economic development program. It will enable us to move through the other list of pressing community needs, City Hall, library, stormwater, transportation, many of the investments that we know we need to make that, for reasons that we understand, many of them have had to be deferred during the Great Recession and the recovery therefrom. So tonight, I intend to vote as evidenced by the fact that I made the motion, and I do again want to thank all the people who have helped us get to the point where we have. We have listened carefully to everyone. Obviously, we have to vote one way or the other, so there are some with whom we will disagree, but simply because your preference did not win does not mean that your input was not highly valuable and led us to the good conclusion I think we reached tonight. Thank you.
Mr. Baruch?
I just wanted to align myself with some of the comments that Councilmember Duncan has made. I share the notion that one of the most difficult, and I wouldn't say by the time we got to the vote it perhaps wasn't difficult, but certainly the process that led to the sale of the water system was in one that most of us kind of came into not by our own doing, but something that we had to manage. And I think that the council and the previous council did the best it could with the cards that were dealt with, taking a very difficult situation and trying to get the best possible outcome for the city and all of our citizens in Falls Church. And I think we did that through the sale of the system. And also sort of one of the highlights, which still is undergoing a lot of work, is bringing the school area the high school area within the city limits, along with a couple other parcels. I think that was a big key that took a lot of work by fellow council members and current council members to make that happen. So I'm ultimately happy and proud of those difficult decisions and the countless number of hours of deliberation that went into bringing that to fruition. But we're at the point of, culminating essentially part of the water sale, and that's the sale of the proceeds. And I distinctly remember when I was just a rookie, let's just say, council member, and sometimes still feel like a rookie today, but when I was starting to just kind of learn about the water system, I remember talking to the CFO at the time, John Toohey, and saying, hey, John, is there any other investment mechanism that would have the same rate of return for the city? And his answer was clearly, absolutely not. And that I kind of walked away with that. And due to the work of Councilmember Kalin, or former Councilmember Kalin in particular, who I think we owe some sincere gratitude given the amount of work that he did. This is certainly within his line of expertise for a number of years that he's been working on economic issues like this. Kind of brought this, I would say, innovative idea to the forefront as a way of managing risks, but also putting the money into an area that could have long-term benefits for all of our citizens and give us the ability to take the cost savings that we would have for the pension system and utilize it elsewhere. And I thought, I sort of, which is my typical fashion, kind of had a lot of questions about it, wasn't sure about it, because normally I'm very risk averse, and this seemed a little risky, a lot of money, so on and so forth. But what I came back with, and what I'm struck with is, during my tenure as mayor, I have shared this with some members of the council and also some members of the public. The water system was not without its own inherent grave risk. You're operating a critical infrastructure, serving water to a large metropolitan area. And during derecho, we had to issue a boil water notice to a large portion of our city in Fairfax, or a large portion of our customer base in Fairfax County and Tyson's Corner. That was probably, I would say, one of my lowest points serving on the council, having to do that from a public safety standpoint. Huge public risk with potential, of things that could happen. Luckily, it was a cautionary prudential matter that we took, but that was not without risk of operating the system, because we had some things go wrong on that day. Not all the city's fault, but nonetheless one that we were ultimately responsible for. So my point is, there was risk in running that system. We are taking some risks by putting a large percentage of this money into the market, if you will, but one that I think is ultimately the right call, and I think we have worked out ways of not doing away with the risk, because there's no good way of doing it. All the options before us have some level of risk, but working on mitigating that risk, and also we've sort of spread the money out in various bucket, if you will. So I think this is the right way to go. A couple points that I'll just emphasize, not that I'm asking for any changes, but it looks like our experts and advisors are going to be advising us on market timing and how to allocate the money. I know that we had lots of presentations about how to do that and ways of segregating the money and slowly putting it in, et cetera, things that were pretty super technical. So I would just ask that our retirement board, along with city staff, paid heed to take a very conservative approach in that way. And if there's a way of sort of making sure that you're consulting to the extent possible and getting feedback from the city on, how are we going to invest this money, and what the time frame, I'd like to get a briefing on that, and if we can have some dialogue about that, just so we all know what's going on and take a prudent approach to sort of market timing, et cetera, if you will. And then third, I'll stand by the comments that I made about the 1.7 million, that I'm not looking for pet projects, that they have to be ways of improving our community, looking towards economic development and using that money to further reduce our tax burden on our taxpayers. So with that, I'll be supporting this. And thanks again to my former colleague, Ira Kalin, and others who worked on this plan and bringing it forward. And I think with all of our comments, this actually got solidified and made it a lot better from the original sort of kernels that we had as we came together on this item.
Okay, other comments? Ms. Conley?
So unlike Mr. Duncan and Mr. Baruch, I was not involved in the sale of the water system, the decision to sell it. So this decision to vote on the disposition of $20.5 million is probably the biggest one that I've been involved in, and it has been really intimidating to me. I am not a financial whiz, and so every time this came up in the 11 work sessions and conversations, I had a lot of questions I asked, and many people helped answer those questions, and I appreciate all that help. And if you've watched those, you know I was very skeptical about this plan to begin with. And then I realized that even though I'm not a financial whiz, I was elected because I see the big picture, and I'm trying to think about this as part of the big picture for Falls Church, and I've been grappling with that for a long time. So I think we need to put this $20.5 million in the context of the entire sale, which is about more than money. It's also about the land. And as Mr. Shields mentioned before, the land where our high school and middle school are is part of this deal, and that's going to generate for us far more than $20.5 million, and we're well on the way to making that happen. And that's going to benefit our city economically and academically for years to come. So the second part is the money, and what we thought was going to be $11 million originally is now $20.5 million, and that's just amazing. So we have a lot more options. And while putting $9.2 million into the pension fund was not my first choice, I think in the context of all the other options we have, it is a fine choice, and it covers an obligation that the city has, and it provides short-term and long-term financial benefit, and provides operating savings that we can use for capital. So my vote is going to come with some concerns, and I already asked Mr. LeCondre about how it's going to be accounted for, but I'm really afraid that this can be lost. The accounting has to be crystal clear and unforgettable. In 2034, I don't want to open the Falls Church News Press and have it say 20 years ago, in 2014, the council did an obscure sleight of hand with $9.2 million. Where did that go? I want to make sure that everybody knows where it is all the time so that we can always account for that money. I think that is so important. And then to have the transfer from operating costs to capital costs be shown as a line item, I think is also really important. So with these three parts to the water system sale working together, I think we really are well on our way to showing a plan for the big picture of Falls Church. So we have land for our new school and economic development. We are fully funding a financial obligation that frees up operating expenses for capital costs, and then we're able to invest in capital needs that will benefit us next year and into the future.
Thank you. Does anyone else wish to make any comments? Mr. Snyder?
Thanks a lot, Mr. Mayor. I've lived through a lot of this history, and unlike Yogi Berra, who said we should keep history in the past, I guess we'll talk about history briefly. And I do want to indicate that I think effectively the courts stripped us of the value of our system. I think that was unfortunate. I think it was wrong. I disagreed with it, but we appealed and we had no choice. That said, as we move forward to the sale of the system, I was pleased to be part of the team, and that I'd suggested mediation, and that's what ended up with, I think, a pretty good outcome for all concerned. But moving forward, I think the fact of the matter is that I think we've engaged in as much due diligence as could be responsibly asked. We've checked out repeatedly the legal issues. We've checked out the financial issues to the extent we possibly can. And due diligence takes time, so it's reasonable to expect, particularly with public resources that are not our personal resources, that our due diligence needs to be particularly careful. Secondly, I think that it takes time to inform the public and then to receive its input, and I think we've done that. I just can't see that delay at this point serves any purpose that's positive. I just can't see it. I think we've gone through the due diligence. have consistently raised significant issues. I think they've been responded to. I think our approach is a diversified approach. We're putting some into the pension system. And after all, the big issue for me there is, in addition to all the other things that have been discussed, we have an obligation to take care of our pension that we've agreed that we're going to provide, and that's what this money is going into doing, at least a chunk of it. And the rest, fortunately, because the numbers are larger, will be available, and almost the original contemplated amounts for things like capital projects. So I think for all that reasons, I'll be supporting this proposal. Now, let me ask the city manager. Some comments were made about our internal controls and governance, and I wonder if you could comment on that. And is anything else needed? And if so, are we going to be moving to put that in place?
Thank you, Vice Mayor Snyder. First, let me acknowledge the fact that in our comprehensive annual financial report and our audit report, for many years has been the observation and the finding that due to our size and due to the personnel that we have in our finance department, that we have insufficient segregation of duties. That's not unique to the City of Falls Church. That's typical for smaller jurisdictions, but nonetheless, it's a finding. To help address that, the City Council did appropriate funds this year to hire an additional person who will work with our Munis software on to provide additional segregation of duties. In our financial procedures and in the way that money works in the City of Falls Church, we have the Munis General Ledger and the Munis Financial Software Package. To disperse any funds requires multiple approvals, and any disbursement over $5,000 has approvals that actually go up to the city manager's office, and it just goes through Munis so we can see what every one of those disbursements is and they're signed off on. So I think we have a very healthy system, and I think with the additional resource that the council has provided, I don't think that will be an audit finding in the future. And so I think that, we have systems in place that work well, and that one additional step of segregation of duties will meet that need.
So the audit findings that were referred to earlier are entirely consistent with what you'd have with a small jurisdiction. As I understand it, you just have fewer people and fewer hands. But for a jurisdiction our size and with a budget our size, was there an internal control problem?
Well, I think, typically with smaller jurisdictions, the dollar amounts are smaller as well. And so the City of Falls Church, because of A, the sale of the water system, and B, our capital program going into future, will be a small jurisdiction that will be dealing with some relatively large numbers. And so that was part of the discussion that we had with the City Council, and I think that was part of the justification for taking a step after many years of knowing that this situation existed, and it's typical for a smaller jurisdiction, that we finally did put resources in it to provide that additional control.
So what I'm hearing you say is that events have changed and therefore requiring greater controls.
Yes.
Thank you.
Other comments? I tell you, most of what needs to be said has been said, so I'm not going to repeat it. But I would like to echo the thanks that others have given to the general public. We know that there have been a number of folks who've taken an awful lot of their time to come and speak with us, speak at town halls, public hearings, send emails, and so we appreciate all that. I'd also like to thank Ms. Ryberg and Mr. Kalin. We've seen you at plenty of meetings, and we appreciate your time and advocacy and insight into what we're, I think, going to be doing shortly. So thank you all. Anyway, I'm going to be voting for this, and why don't we go ahead and move this along? Unless there's any other comments, why don't we go ahead and call a roll call vote?
Mr. Baruch,
Yes.
Ms. Conley,
Yes.
Mr. Duncan,
Yes.
Ms. Oliver,
Yes.
Mr. Snyder,
Yes.
Mr. Z,
Abstain.
Mayor Tarter.
Yes.
Motion carries with one abstention.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out this evening. We still have some additional business on the agenda, but, excuse me? Absolutely. Let's take a 5-minute break. Thank you all. If we can, let's go ahead and resume our meeting and try to power through by 10:30, which is 14 minutes from now. We try that. Madam Clerk, will you call the next item, please?
Yes, we have TR 1438, resolution to authorize an application for funding from the Federal Transportation Alternatives Program for fiscal year 2016.
This was discussed at work session, and it does require a 20% local match, and we would be applying for funds to help us with planning work on Park Avenue as part of their Great Streets program. It is required before we submit this application that A, we have council authorization to submit it, and B, that we have a public hearing for it. And so we hope to accomplish both tonight.
Thank you. Are there any comments? Are there any member of the public that wishes to address this item? Seeing none, the matter is closed to the public. This was discussed at the work session. Last time, Mr. Baruch?
Just one request again, just to remind staff that given this is a document that could go to the federal government, that my name shouldn't be associated with anything that goes to the federal government or the federal courts.
Yes, sir.
Okay, unless we have any other comments or questions, do we have a motion? Mr. Z?
Mayor, move passage of TR 14-38.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Madam Clerk, will you call the roll call vote, please?
Mr. Baruch?
Yes.
Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Z?
Yes.
Mayor Tarter?
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Madam Clerk, will you call the next item, please?
TR 1439, resolution to authorize projects under the revenue sharing program with the Virginia Department of Transportation for fiscal year 2016.
And this is a grant to the Virginia Department of Transportation in the amount of $400,000. This requires a 50-50 local match, and the funds would be used for intersection improvements throughout the city. This also was discussed at work session.
Are there any questions of Mr. Shields? Is there any member of the public? Go ahead, Mr. Baruch.
Sorry, just the same comment that I made before about my name. Not appearing, that is to federal government or courts.
Is there any member of the public that wishes to address this item? Seeing none, the matter is closed to the public. Are there any council comments, discussion? Yes.
Mr. Mayor, I move approval, passage of TR 14-39.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Mr. Duncan on the second. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll call vote?
Mr. Baruch?
Yes.
Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Z?
Yes.
Mayor Tarter?
Yes.
And the motion passes.
Thank you. Will you call the next item, Madam Clerk?
We have TR 1440, a resolution to amend the city's basic and police pension plans to reflect the funding of the plans with the use of water sale proceeds.
This is a resolution that was drafted with the help of outside legal counsel. It's been reviewed by the chairman of the retirement board and has been out for discussion since May with some minor changes prior to tonight's meeting. It does reflect the retirement board's initial recommendations that if the funds put into the pension plan would be treated as a sub-account, and only the earnings from that amount of money placed in the pension fund would be used only to lower the employer's cost on an annual basis. And so this resolution would amend the plans to do that. And then lastly, it also states that upon termination of the plans, the employer intends that the additional contribution made in this year will revert to the employer. So that's the two functions of this resolution and the amendment to the plans.
Are there any questions for Mr. Shields? Mr. Baruch and Ms. Conley?
More along the ways of a comment. I think this sort of addresses a point that I was trying to make very early on, so I'm glad to see this coming forward, that this really puts into a resolution what the expectation is, that it reduces the city's obligations, not the employees.
Correct.
So it does give us a lever if things go wrong, that we can make adjustments to one side of the ledger if we choose to. So I think that's a really important point. And I'll just sort of, I probably should have made it earlier, but I think it's more appropriate to make it now that, you know, the city employees who are under the pension plan, while I think it's a great vehicle, are getting a little bit more surety in their pension system, that we're backing it even more fervently than we were before, given the infusion of funding that's going to go in. And part of that is if we have to make adjustments and do other smoothing mechanisms because of volatility, that's something I'm going to consider is, you know, the commitment we've put in, and I think this helps solidify that point. So I'm very much in support of this motion, glad to see it come forward. The one question that I did have is, this is coming up as a resolution. I just want to get confirmation that a resolution rather than an ordinance is an appropriate mechanism for this.
Yes, the council does amend the pension plans from time to time, and it is always done by resolution.
So in that single reading? Thank you.
Ms. Conley?
I just want to do I need to read this again since I'm invested in the city pension plan? I think I should.
Well, you could if you want to. I don't think it's necessary, because this is an action that amends the plan, but is not necessarily, well, it may affect the group.
I'm
Maybe
going to
you should
read it again, just
Go
to be
ahead.
sure.
Yes.
With regard to this item before council, the transaction before the council is a resolution that changes the city's basic and police pension plans. For 8 years, I was a part-time employee of the Falls Church City Schools, and therefore I am vested in the city's retirement system. Therefore, I am a member of a business, profession, or group of 3 or more persons, the members of which may be affected by the transaction, and I am able to participate in this transaction fairly, objectively, and in the public interest.
Okay, I'll do part 2. The transaction before the city council involves the city's pension plan. Because my wife's an employee of the Falls Church City Schools, she may become vested in the city's retirement system. However, I'm a member of a business, profession, or group of 3 or more persons, the members of which are affected by this action. But I'm able to participate in the transaction fairly, objectively, in the public interest. Any other discussion? Do we have a motion? Let me just open up to the public quickly. Is there any member of the public that wishes to address this item? Seeing none, the matter is closed to the public. Do we have a motion?
Mr. Mayor, move adoption of TR 14-40.
Second. Madam Clerk, will you call the roll call vote?
Mr. Baruch?
Yes.
Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Z?
Yes.
Mayor Tarter?
Yes.
Motion carries 7-0.
Thank you. Let me find an agenda here. Let's see. Okay, so we are now on to the consent items. Is that right?
And on consent, we have just one item and then appointments. The one item is authorization for the city manager to sign a 1-year agreement between the Fairfax County Health Department and the City of Falls Church. And this is our contract with Fairfax County to provide a whole host of consumer protection programs, our health inspections in restaurants throughout the cities, child care facility inspections. I will note that is also, as I noted earlier in tonight's meeting, our partner in assisting our community in recovery and prevention from epidemics and the spread of disease. In short, this is an important contract for the city. The funding associated with it is as projected during budget adoption, so there's no changes to what our planned budget was for this item.
Do we have any comments, questions, any desire to remove this from the consent agenda? Seeing none, do we have a motion? Is there any member of the public that wishes to address this matter? No. Seeing none, the matter is closed to the public. Do we have a motion to adopt the consent agenda, the consent items?
I'll move to approve the consent items.
Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a second, Mr. Duncan in the second. Madam Clerk, you call the roll call vote?
Mr. Baruch?
Yes.
Ms. Conley?
Yes.
Mr. Duncan?
Yes.
Ms. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Snyder?
Yes.
Mr. Z?
Yes.
Mayor Tarter?
Yes.
Consent items pass 7-0.
Okay. Is there any business not on the agenda that anyone would like to bring forth? Want to take that as a no, unless Ms. Conley has something?
I just want to put on the record to ask to have that light fixed above us.
We have a second?
Second.
Any member of the public wish to address the light buzzing above our heads?
Address the light.
Okay, anything else on the agenda?
Are we commenting?
Please.
Briefly, as mentioned, Budget Finance Committee is scheduled to meet tomorrow night, 7:30 here at City Hall. Government Ops Committee also is to meet tomorrow at noon to talk about, I'm not quite sure what, because Ms. Conley and I, as the only two members, are so observant of the open meetings law that we don't even talk about what we're going to talk about, so. But the manager, I hope, will anticipate that we'll be there at noon tomorrow for the GovOps meeting.
You know what, I need to interrupt and say I just realized I cannot attend
The
tomorrow's
GovOps meeting has been canceled.
Sorry about that.
Actually,
So maybe you could handle it, you
this news just in.
could talk to yourself.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other council member comments?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm a member of the City Hall Task Force by your appointment, and we had our first meeting last week. The City Hall Public Safety, work that we're doing on City Hall. And there's a website and all sorts of cool information, and so I will ask each of you to read the email that will come to you, because I'm supposed to come around and get your sentiments on it and feed that back to the task force on November the 13th.
Thank you. Any other,
Sorry.
Ms. Oliver and then
If
Mr.
I could
Brewer?
just ask that we set the next meeting time for the EDC, please?
That's what I was going to get to, actually. Celeste, if you'd be so kind, yet another reminder to send out some type of poll so we can figure out our next EDC meeting time. That sounds right. Okay. Thank you. EDC members, please vote, and EDC reps from boards and commissions, please vote as well. We'd like to get your input. And then just a reminder that I'm going to be out of town Monday, the first or the second Monday of November.
Okay, Ms. Conley?
I see that Mr. Clinton is still here and Mr. Laporta. Oh, well, I was just going to ask about October 31st was the date of the DMV possibly closing, and what, have we come to a resolution of this?
All right, if we can- Let me finish, let her finish her thing.
I don't know. I'm just wondering what's going to happen. Where are we?
Maybe if we could follow up after and get a public communication out as to what its status is, if that would be
Okay.
satisfactory to the council.
Okay.
All right, I've been informed that we are seconds away from going over 10:30, so do we need a motion, or should we have a motion?
Can we
to,
defer the minutes, or
Yeah, we could defer the minutes and get out of here, but
move we adjourn?
let's just get the minutes banged out.
Celeste has worked so hard. Come on.
All right, so is there any comments on the consent, or the minutes? Does anyone have any
I
comments?
provided one edit to Celeste. It's in the revised version.
Anyone else?
Yeah, on the minutes of September the 22nd, I was absent due to work.
Okay.
Thanks.
Are there any other comments to the minutes, or can we get them approved in the next 15, 18 seconds? All right, so do we have a motion to adopt the minutes?
Can we do it separately?
Subject, sure. Do we have a motion to adopt the minutes of July 14th, 2014, subject to the comments that Mr. Baruch had provided?
Yes, move to approve the Monday, July 14th minutes as revised.
Do we have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Yes, have it. Okay, the minutes of September 22nd, 2014. Do we have a motion to approve those? Anyone? Mr. Z?
Move to adopt the minutes of September 22nd, 2014.
Second?
Second.
Ms. Conley on the second. Are there any edits, changes to those? It's noted that Mr. Snyder was absent for that meeting, for business travel. Okay, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? The ayes have it.
I had one abstention. I wasn't here at that meeting.
Okay, so abstention from Mr. Baruch and Mr. Snyder. Okay, do we have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? The ayes have it. We are adjourned. Thank you.